The shock goad hummed the way a wasp hums, and the cub would not break. Karst Hollow ran its wetting floor cold on purpose, cold enough that breath smoked and metal bit through gloves, because the overwatchers believed a hungry animal in a hungry room grew teeth faster. Down in the pit, under the white glare of the ceiling panels, a sabren cub no bigger than a feed crate crouched against the far wall and shivered and refused to become a weapon. The two handlers circling it had done everything the manual told them to do. They had starved it a day past the line. They had piped the smell of blood into the vents. They had dragged a squealing drone target across the floor on a wire to wake the killing reflex, and the cub had watched the target with its ember eyes and then looked away. And that looking away was, in the language of the program, a failure. Juno Hale stood on the feed catwalk above the pit, with a bucket of thawed protein in each hand, and watched the cub decide to be gentle in a place that had no use for gentleness. "Again," said the senior handler below, a broad gray Sethin named Korik, and the junior beside him lowered the goad. The rod touched the cub's flank. The wasp hum climbed. The cub screamed a thin, breaking sound, more infant than beast, and did not attack the target. It attacked the wall. It threw its small body at the sheer plating as if the wall were the enemy, as if the wall had done this, and slid down, leaving 4 shallow scratches and a smear of frost, and lay there breathing in shudders while the goad's charge bled off into the air. Korik made a note on his slate. In the program's shorthand it would read, Unit K5, non-responsive to escalation, recommend reassessment. Everyone on the floor knew what reassessment meant this deep into a litter's conditioning. It meant a needle and a cold drawer and a fresh cub pulled from the breeding pens to fill the empty number. Juno had fed K5 every morning for 31 days. She set the buckets down. She did not decide to do it in any way she could have explained later. She had spent her whole short life being the quiet one, the contract girl who kept her head down and her hands busy, the only human on a station full of Sethin who called her the primate when they thought she couldn't parse their clicks. Deciding was not a thing people like her got to do, but she watched the cub throw itself at a wall rather than at a screaming target, and something in her that had no rank and no permission stood up and walked her to the ladder. Feed hand. Korik had heard her boots on the rungs. You are not cleared for pit contact during a wedding. It's past feed time, Juno said, which was true and meaningless, and kept climbing down. Up on the observation gallery, behind the glass, a junior overwatcher named Osk Rimes set down his stylus and leaned forward without meaning to. Osk had been at Karst Hollow 4 months, long enough to stop flinching at the screams and to hate himself a little for that. He was young for his caste, still soft in the joints of his opinions, and he had noticed the human before everyone noticed the human. She was the only one, but he had never seen her do anything but move quietly along the catwalks with her buckets, keeping to the edges of rooms the way small, clever animals did. Now she was climbing down into a pit with a distressed apex predator in it, unarmed, in a padded coat 2 sizes too big. And Osk's first clear thought was that he was about to watch a person die and would have to write the report. His second thought, slower, was that the cub had stopped screaming. Down in the pit the cold came up through Juno's boots. K5 pressed itself into the corner and watched her with its whole trembling body, the way a beaten thing watches, ready for the next bad thing to arrive. Its ember eyes tracked the goad in Korik's hand more than they tracked her. That told her something. It wasn't afraid of hands. It was afraid of the rod. I need you both to back up, Juno said to the 2 handlers, not loudly. Korik laughed a dry click. You need. You keep it cornered, it keeps fighting the corner, she said. Give it room, it stops, back up. This is a wedding, primate, not a petting. But Korik was a career handler with 30 litters behind him, and a slate full of non-responsive notes he did not want to keep writing, and some worn-down part of him was curious enough to take 1 step back and drag the junior with him. 1 minute. Then we clear you out and finish the assessment. Juno did not have a plan for 1 minute. She had a lifetime of a thing she'd never had words for, which was that she was more comfortable with animals than with almost anyone, and that comfort ran downhill into them somehow even when she said nothing. She lowered herself to the cold floor. Not crouching was a predator's shape, coiled ready. She sat, all the way down, flat on the frozen plating, legs folded, hands loose and open in her lap, making herself the smallest and lowest and least dangerous thing in the room. She let her shoulders drop. She looked at the cub's feet instead of its eyes. And she hummed. It wasn't a song. It was the low, tuneless thing her grandmother used to make over the incubator lambs on a colony Juno barely remembered, a sound with no words and no edges, pitched under the breath, more felt in the chest than heard in the ear. She didn't know why she did it. Her body knew. K5's quills, which had been standing along its spine in a stiff ridge of alarm, dropped a fraction. Behind the glass, Oscar watched the cub's spinal ridge lower and felt the hair stir along his own plated forearms, because he had read the same manuals Korik had, and one thing every manual agreed on was that a wedding-stressed sabren did not lower its quills for anyone. Lowered quills meant the animal had decided it was safe. Nothing at Karst Hollow was safe. That was the entire design. "Are you recording this?" Osk said to the tech beside him. "Everything's recorded," the tech said, bored. "Record it closer." In the pit, Juno kept humming and kept still and kept her eyes low, and after a long while, a minute more, she'd lost the thread of Korik's countdown. K5 uncoiled from its corner, one paw at a time. It did not rush her. It crept belly low, the way a thing comes toward warmth it does not trust, freezing whenever her breath changed, flowing again when the hum resumed. It reached her folded knee. It smelled her glove, her cuff, the seam of her coat where the protein buckets had left their scent. Then it did a thing that made Korik stop breathing, and the junior swear a soft click of a swear. It put its narrow, shivering head against the inside of Juno's wrist and leaned its whole weight there, and closed its eyes, and let out a breath so long it seemed to empty the cub entirely. Juno moved one hand, slow, telegraphed, no surprises, and laid it flat along the cub's flank where the goad had touched, over the 4 shallow scratches and the memory of the wasp hum, and she left it there, warm still, promising nothing but that it would not hurt. "There," she murmured, so low the microphones almost missed it. "There, nobody's wetting anything today." Korik looked at his slate, where the last note still read "recommend reassessment," and did not know what to write under it. The comm on the gallery wall chimed, and a voice came through it, flat and even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it. "Korik, bring the feed hand to my office when she's finished playing nursemaid, and do not needle the K5 unit. I want it kept." Oscar turned toward the glass, and there, reflected in it over the pit, stood overwatcher Vantor, who ran the wedding program at Karst Hollow, who had come up the tower stairs without anyone hearing him because he always did, watching the human hold a failed weapon like it was a sleeping child. Vantor's flat vertical pupils had narrowed to blades, but he wasn't looking at the cub the way Korik looked at it, as a problem. He was looking at it the way an engineer looks at a tool he did not know he had. "Interesting," Vantor said to no one and left. Vantor's office was warm. That was the first thing Juno noticed and hated, that he kept it warm while he kept the cubs cold, and that told her more about him than anything he'd say. He did not offer her a seat. He stood at his window wall looking down through 40 meters of ice-lit dark at the breeding pens, where the next litters slept in their numbered cells, and he spoke to her reflection. "Do you know what a sabren is worth, feed hand?" "No, sir." Grown, wetted, deployed against a soft target, a colony, a transport hub, a conquered supply moon, one adult sabren is worth a company of warhost infantry and costs the Sethe nothing but meat and patience. They cannot be jammed. They cannot be turned by propaganda. They do not surrender, they do not fear artillery, and they cannot be bought because they want nothing a bribe can offer. He turned. He was tall even for his caste, gray plating on the color of old pewter, and he had a way of holding perfectly still that made the room feel like it was holding still around him. The war on the Vel Reach has gone badly for 2 years. The warhost is bleeding, and my program is meant to be the answer, 100 liters, wedded to a hair trigger, dropped on the enemy's tender places until they beg. That is what Karst Hollow is for. That is what your buckets feed. Juno said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence cost less than words. And it is failing, Vantor said, and the admission was so calm it was almost worse than shouting. Do you know why? No, sir. Because a hair trigger is not a weapon. It is an accident waiting for a direction. We can make them savage. We have made hundreds of them savage. But a savage sabren attacks the handler, the transport, the wall, the nearest living thing. It attacks the corner feed hand, as you saw today, and a weapon that cannot be aimed is a liability we drop from orbit and call a loss. The wedding produces rage. Rage is undirected. What the warhost needs, what I have promised them and cannot yet deliver, is a sabren that is savage to the enemy and steady to us. Loyalty, feed hand. The one thing the goad cannot install. He let that sit. And this morning I watched a starved, wedding-broken K5 unit that my best handler had marked for the drawer lower its quills, cross a pit, and fall asleep against a human's wrist. In 31 days of your feeding it, apparently, without a single directive from anyone, you did the thing my entire program exists to do and cannot. The heat of the room pressed on Juno's face. She understood, all at once and with a dropping cold in her stomach, that she had not saved the cub. She had made it valuable. I want to know how you did it, Vantor said. I sat down, Juno said. He waited for more. There was no more. She watched him decide she was being simple with him, and watched him decide that simplicity might itself be the technique, that the human's very smallness, her lowness, her lack of threat, was a lever the tall, armored handlers with their rods could never pull. She could see him already turning it into a procedure with a number. You are reassigned, Vantor said. Effective now. You will keep the K5 unit and the rest of its litter, the 6th wedding, 6 units, 1 already lost. You will not be a feed hand. You will be the litter's conditioner. You will make them steady. You will make them bond, and when they are grown and steady and bonded, you will teach them to take a direction. He turned back to his window. You will make me my weapon, feed hand, softly if softly works. I do not care about the method. I care about the result. And if I won't, Juno said. She had not meant to say it. It came out of the same nameless place that had walked her down the ladder. Vantor did not turn around. You are a contract worker 40 light years from the nearest human port, on a facility that does not officially exist, holding a debt bond to a Sethan labor broker who owns your passage home. You have no leverage, no rank, and no witnesses who would care. He said it without heat, the way he said everything, reciting a fact. But I would rather not compel you, because compulsion makes people sullen and sullen people make poor conditioners. So let me offer you the thing you actually want, since you are too simple to hide it. If you do this, the litter lives, all 5. I will not needle the K5. I will not needle any of them for non-response, no matter how gentle they stay, so long as you keep them progressing. That is the whole of my offer. Refuse, and I return the litter to the wedding floor tonight, and start the drawers at the runt. Juno looked at the pens 40 meters down, all those numbered sleeping shapes, and she thought about the cub's breath emptying against her wrist, and she understood that he had already won, because he had found the exact shape of the thing she could not walk away from and put it between his fingers. They get real food, she said, not the past-the-line ration, real, and the goads stay off the floor when I'm working. A pause. In the glass she saw the corner of Vantor's mouth move, which on a Sethan was as close to a smile as the plating allowed. Done, he said. Osk Remeh will be your handler of record. He is young enough to still think this is interesting. He picked up his slate. One more thing, feed hand. Do not mistake what has happened here. You did not win an argument. You accepted a job. The moment you stop being useful to me, the offer ends and the drawers open. Keep them steady. Keep them progressing, and I will keep the runt out of the cold." He did not look up again. Juno had been dismissed. She walked out past Oscar Rimet, who was waiting in the corridor with his stylus and his soft young opinions and an expression she couldn't read, and she went down 4 levels of stairs to the pens, and she found the cell marked with the number of the 6th wedding, and she sat down on the floor outside it, and only then, where no Sethan could see a human's face do the thing human faces did her hands begin to shake. She named them within the week, because she could not stand the numbers. The runt K5, the one who threw itself at walls, she called him Cole, for the banked fire color of his eyes and because the word felt small and warm in the mouth. The biggest of the litter, K1, a broad-shouldered male already showing the heavy jaw the adults grew, she called Bracken. The wariest, a lean female who watched every door and never ate until the others had, K2, she called Sedge. The 2 middle cubs, near enough alike that even the handlers mixed them up, became Reed and Marrow. Marrow for the one that limped from an old wedding injury in its hip that had set wrong. Oscar Rimet wrote the names in the log the first time she used them, under the unit numbers, in the small neat column meant for behavioral notes, and then sat looking at what he'd written for a while. "You can't name them," he told her the second day, watching her push a bowl of real thawed meat under the cell door reel, as promised. Vantor kept his bargains, which was somehow the most frightening thing about him. "When they deploy, they'll be logged by unit. Naming them makes it," he stopped, because the human had looked up at him and there was nothing hostile in her plain, flat face, only a patience that made him feel younger than he was. "It makes it harder," he finished. "For who?" Juno said. Osk did not have an answer, so he wrote that down too. The bond went faster than the manual said it could, and that was the second frightening thing, though only Juno understood why it frightened her and not the Sethan. The Sethan thought she was performing a technique. She was not performing anything. She simply refused, hour after hour, to be a source of pain, in a place where every other tall shape the cubs had ever met had been nothing but, and against that steady refusal the cubs bent like plants toward a window. She sat with them. She hummed her grandmother's tuneless keeping sound. She let them come to her and never once reached first. She learned that Cole liked his chin scratched, and Bracken liked to lean his whole growing weight against her spine, and Sedge would only take food from her fingers if the others were looking away. Some private dignity the little female would not surrender in company. She learned that Marrow's hip hurt in the cold, and that a warm hand laid along the joint would make the cub sigh and stretch. She learned the hum was not just hers, that when she made it low enough, the cubs made it back, all 5 of them, a sound she felt in her sternum before she heard it, a shared vibration that ran between them and knit them into one animal with 6 hearts. Osk noticed the hum on the 9th day. He was reviewing the pen's audio when he found a band of subsonic frequency, below the threshold of Sethan hearing, rising every time the human sat with the litter rising from her, and then answered, doubled, tripled from the cubs. He played it slowed and lifted into range, and sat very still in the dark of the monitor room listening to a sound that had no aggression in it at all, a sound like a hive at rest, like something purring in a register too deep for purring, and he understood that he was listening to a pack forming, and that the anchor of the pack, the point they all oriented toward, the thing they were becoming a pack around, was a 22-year-old human girl with a debt bond and a bucket. He wrote it up. He had to, it was data, and Vantor read everything. He called it, in the log, the litter's anchor orientation behavior, and noted the subsonic band, and recommended, because he was still young enough to think a recommendation might steer the thing, that the anchor orientation be studied for stability rather than exploited for control. Vantor read it that night and wrote a single line back in the margin, which Osk found the next morning and did not show the human. "Excellent, the anchor is the aiming mechanism. Proceed." The word aiming stayed in Osk's head like grit under a lid. He watched more carefully after that, And what he watched was the human teaching a pack to trust her, while a man 40 meters up watched her teach the pack to trust her, and both of them calling it different things. To Juno, it was keeping 5 frightened animals alive. To Vantor, it was calibrating a targeting system that happened to run on affection. The horror of it, Osk decided, was not that the two things looked different. It was that they looked exactly the same, and only the intent behind the glass told them apart. The cubs grew. Sabren grew fast when they were fed. That was one reason the program starved them, to slow them into a longer, more moldable childhood. And Juno fed them, real meat, all they wanted, because she would not do the other thing, and this was the thing she could do. In a month, Cole was no longer a feed crate size. In 2 he came to her knee. By the time the moon called Ves Minor had swung Karst Hollow through a full turn around its dim primary, and the corridors had cycled from cold dark to cold dark again, the 6th wedding had gone from cubs she could lift to young Sabren that came to her waist, shoulders filling out, the ridge of quills along their spines thickening into the black-spined mantles the adults wore, the ember eyes gone from frightened to something steadier and far more dangerous, not because they had been wedded, but because they had grown up safe and were therefore not afraid of anything, which is its own kind of teeth. They followed her now. That was the change everyone on the floor could see. When Juno walked the pen level, the 5 of them moved with her behind the mesh, tracking her down the corridor, and when she stopped they stopped, and when she turned they turned, a thing they did without command because she was the fixed point their world revolved around. The handlers had started calling it, dryly, the parade. Korik, who still ran weddings on other litters down the hall and still filled slates with the word non-responsive and still sent cubs to the drawers, watched the 6th wedding parade pass their own mesh after their human and said once to Osk, "That's not conditioning. That's a religion." He did not mean it kindly. Vantor meant to test it. He did not tell Juno he was testing it. He told her the litter was progressing well, and that the warhost had begun asking for a demonstration, and that she should be proud of her work. And Juno heard the word demonstration, and felt the cold come up through her boots again, even in the warm office. Because she was not simple, whatever the Sethan thought. And she knew that a weapon a general asks to see is a weapon a general means to use. What Vantor did was this. On a day Juno was rotated to the far pens to see the younger litters. A rotation he ordered specifically to get her off the floor. He had Korik and 3 handlers take the 6th wedding into the wedding pit, the same white cold pit where Cole had once thrown himself at a wall, and he had them run the litter through a live directional wedding. A bound, conquered prisoner, a scout they'd taken off a downed courier weeks back, dragged out onto the floor as a target, and the goads brought up, and the pack driven toward the killing they had never been driven to before. Osk was in the gallery because Vantor ordered him there to record it. He would remember it a long time. The 5 Sabren came onto the floor and did not attack. They did not attack the prisoner, and they did not attack the handlers. They spread. Osk saw it, and his stylus stopped. They spread into a loose arc, Bracken at the center and Sedge and Cole at the flanks and Reed and Marrow filling between, facing outward, facing the handlers and the goads, and they put themselves between the whole armored apparatus of the program and the one soft bound thing on the floor, and they began, all 5, to hum. Not the resting hum. Osk had cataloged the resting hum. This was lower, and it had a grind in it, a sound like a rock fall deciding whether to fall, and every handler on the floor took a step back from it without being told, because 600 million years of being small furred things that fled from big furred things does not wash out of a spine in one generation, and the Sethan spine remembered even if the Sethan mind sneered. Korik brought the goat up anyway. He was brave, in the stupid way of a man who has never yet been made to understand a thing. He touched the rod to Bracken's flank the way he'd touched it to Cole's 31 days and a lifetime ago, and brought up the wasp hum, and expected the young Sabren to flinch and break the way cubs broke. Bracken did not flinch. Bracken turned his head slowly on that heavy jaw and looked at Korik down the length of the rod, and closed his teeth on it, on the goad itself, on the charged tip, taking the shock full in his mouth and not letting go, and bit it in half. Then he spat the sparking end onto the floor and went back to facing outward and humming over the prisoner. "Clear the floor," Vantor said over the comm, still calm, always calm. "Clear the floor. Do not needle them." Osk marked the recording. Osk marked it. His hands were not entirely steady. When Juno came back from the far pens, they told her nothing. But she came down to the mesh, and the 5 of them pressed against it to reach her. And she saw the shock burn scored across the roof of Bracken's mouth when he yawned. And she saw the halved goad still lying out on the wetting floor beyond the pit glass where no one had wanted to go pick it up. And she put it together the way she put everything together, quietly and completely, and without saying much. She sat down at the mesh. She hummed. 5 great young heads came down to the level of hers. "You didn't do it," she said to them, so low the microphone strained. "They pushed you and you didn't do it. Good." Her voice did a thing it did not usually do. "You're good. You're so good you don't do that. You hear me? You never do that, not for them. Not for anyone, only if it's me. Only ever if it's for me." Up in the gallery, Vantor watched the human tell the weapon the exact condition under which it would fire, and did not correct her, because she had just installed, for free, the last piece he needed. He had spent 2 years and 100 litters trying to build a sabren that was savage to the enemy and steady to the handler. He had it backwards, he saw now. You did not make the animal steady to the handler. You made the animal love one small, unarmed thing so completely that it would tear the moon apart at a word from her. And then you controlled the small, unarmed thing. "Osk," Vantor said, "draw up a bond dependency profile on the human. Health, debt status, psychological pressure points, the works. If she is the trigger, I want to understand the trigger." Osk said, "Yes, overwatcher," and went and did it, because he was a junior of his caste on a facility that did not exist, and because he had not yet found the place in himself where the word no lived. But he did the profile slowly, and he left things out. Here is what the profile would have said if Osk Rimet had told the whole truth. Juno Hale was 22 Terran years old. She had been born on a hydroponics colony called Ashford's Rest that failed when she was 9, sold off in pieces to cover its water debt, and she had spent the years since moving through the labor broker circuits of the outer Sethin Reach, the way water moves through gravel, downhill, and into whatever crack was open. She had no family the records could find. She had a debt bond that would take, at contract rate, 19 more years to clear. She had a way with animals that 3 prior placements had noted and none had valued, because animals were not what those placements needed. She had a temper that had never once been seen. She was, on paper, the most disposable being on Karst Hollow, which was the whole reason she had been assigned to feed the wedding litters in the first place. Because if a wedding cub took her arm off, the paperwork was nothing. What the profile would not have said, because Osk did not know how to write it, was that the human was not lonely in the way the Sethin assumed all humans were lonely, exiles among a colder species. Juno had been lonely her whole life among her own kind, and had stopped expecting otherwise. What had happened to her at Karst Hollow was not that she had grown attached to 5 animals out of desperation. What had happened was that 5 animals had looked at her, past the smell of the buckets and the coat too big for her and the debt bond and the disposability, and had decided freely, the way nothing in her life had ever freely decided anything about her, that she was theirs. And a person who has never in her life been chosen does not, when she is finally chosen, let go. Osk sat with the profile a long time and then wrote, in the psychological pressure points field only, "Subject is stable and cooperative. Recommend no additional pressure." He knew it was a lie of omission. He told himself it was accurate as far as it went. He was learning slowly, the thing Juno had known since she was 9. which was that in a place like this, the only power a small person had was the power to leave true things out of the record. The demonstration was scheduled for the turn of the season, when the warhost delegation could route through Vess Minor on its way back from the Vel Reach front, and Vantor spent that interval making the 6th wedding into something a general would want to buy. He could not make Juno cruel, so he made cruelty unnecessary. He gave the pack a range, a mocked-up strip of enemy ground built out on the ice under a pressure dome, with target drones and armored dummies and a scent map of conquered biology, and he had Juno walk it with them. And the sabren, who would do anything within sight of her, learned the ground because she was on it. He gave them directions dressed as games. He had Osk teach Juno hand signs and told her they were for safety, for keeping the big animals steady in a crowd, and Juno half believed him because she wanted to and half didn't because she wasn't simple, and taught the signs to the pack: a flat hand for down, a closed fist for hold, 2 fingers for come, a sweep of the arm for the direction she wanted them to look. The pack learned the signs in days. They learned them because her hands made them, and they watched her hands the way drowning things watch a rope. And Vantor watched the pack learn to move where a human hand pointed, and he was patient, and he was pleased, and he wrote nothing down that Juno could ever find. The only one who saw the whole shape of it was Osk, and Osk was one junior overwatcher with a stylus and a growing sickness in his gut, and what could he do? He tried once to say something to her. He found her at the mesh late in a cold dark cycle, when the floor was empty, sitting with Cole's great head in her lap, Cole, the runt, who was no longer a runt, who came to her chest now, and whose jaws could take a handler's leg but who still turned to putty when she scratched the particular spot under his chin. Osk stood at a careful distance, because he was not stupid, and the pack knew his smell, but a pack is a pack. "They're going to use them," he said. "You know that. The demonstration, the warhost. They're going to send them to the front, and they're going to send them because of you, because of what you built. I don't think you should keep building it." Juno kept scratching under Cole's chin. The sabren's ember eye rolled half shut. The resting hum ran between the 5 of them, low, felt more than heard. "I know what he's doing," she said. She didn't look up. "You think I don't. You think because I sit on the floor and hum I don't know that man is stacking me and mine into a weapon he can point." Her voice stayed level, which was worse than if it hadn't. "I've been sold off since I was 9, handler. I know exactly when I'm being sold. The difference is he's got the runt's life in one hand and the whole litter's in the other, and every day I keep them steady is a day none of them go in a drawer. So I keep them steady, and I teach them the signs, and I feed them real meat, and I wait." "Wait for what?" For the first time she looked up at him, and Osk saw the temper the profile said no one had ever seen, not hot, not wild, but banked deep, the color of Cole's eyes. "For the day he finds out he built it backwards," Juno said. Osk did not understand her then. He would. The first time the pack showed the floor what it would do, it was Korik's own fault, and Korik was the kind of man who would go to his grave calling it the animals. It happened over nothing, which is how these things happen. A younger litter 2 cells down had a cub gone feral from overwetting, screaming and slamming the mesh, and Korik was trying to net it, and the net line fouled, and in the frustration of the moment, with the human right there, watching, always watching, with that flat quiet judgment on her plain face that he had come to hate more than he could say, Korik turned and put it on her. He grabbed a fistful of the front of her too big coat and slammed her back against the mesh of the 6th wedding's own cell, and put his gray-plated face down into hers, and told her the animals could smell her softness, and it was making his floor unmanageable, and if she came near his weddings again he would have her bond revoked and drop down a mine shaft, and he shook her once hard, so her head knocked the mesh. He felt the mesh go hot against his knuckles before he understood why. Bracken hit the mesh from the other side at the level of Korik's throat, and only the mesh, rated for a wedding-maddened adult, barely kept the sabren's jaws off him. The impact threw Korik back a full step. And it was not the hit that stopped his heart in his chest. He would admit that much later to Osk over strong drink. It was the sound. All 5 of them came to the mesh and none of them screamed. They did the low grinding hum, the rockfall hum, and they fixed him, 10 ember eyes, absolutely steady and bracken, pressed to the mesh where a moment ago a girl's head had knocked it, opened his jaws slowly and did not make a sound at all, just showed Korik the whole architecture of what would happen the instant the mesh failed, and then closed them gently and hummed. They were not defending their territory. Osk, reviewing it, was certain of that. Territory defense in Sabren had a signature and this was not it. They had watched a tall thing lay hands on their anchor, and they had promised, in the only grammar they had, to unmake him for it. Juno straightened her coat. She was breathing hard. She put one hand flat on the mesh, and 5 great heads turned from Korik to her hand, and the grinding hum dropped by degrees back into the resting hum, and the pack stood down because she told them to, without a word, with a palm on a wire. "You don't," she said to them, low, shaking a little, and it wasn't clear even to her whether she was scolding them or thanking them. "Not for this. He's not worth the drawer, you hear me? Not for this." Then she looked at Korik, and the temper the profile said no one had ever seen came up into her face at last, just for a second, banked and deep and terrible in something so small. "But you should think," she said quietly, "about what happens the day the mesh isn't there." Korik put in a formal complaint. Vantor read it and declined to act on it and had the incident logged instead under a heading Osk had never seen the Overwatcher use before. Protective response to anchor threat, confirmed. Then Vantor added in his margin, "The anchor's safety is now a program asset. Protect the human. Ensure no handler damages the trigger." And Korik was quietly rotated to the far pens and never worked the 6th wedding's floor again, and told himself it was a promotion, and it was not. Osk brought Juno the news that Korik was gone, thinking it would ease her. It did not, and he was young enough to be surprised. "He didn't move Korik to protect me," she said. She was mixing feed, not looking at him. "He moved Korik to protect the trigger. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference, and you should learn to see it, handler, because one day it's going to be pointed at you too." They put the spurs in during a health rotation, while Juno was made to be elsewhere. She found out 3 days later, and she found out by accident, because Vantor was careful and Osk was, at that point, still more careful than brave. What she found was a fresh line of stitching under the mantle quills at the base of Cole's skull, a small healing seam where the fur had been shaved and was growing back. And when she found it on Cole, she checked and found it on all 5, the same place, the same small cruel seam. She did not raise her voice. She went and found Osk in the monitor room, and she stood in the doorway until he turned around, and she said, "What did you put in my pack?" Osk had known this moment would come. He had rehearsed lies for it and found, when it arrived, that he could not spend them. "A control implant," he said, "subdermal at the cranial base." He made himself hold her eyes. It's a 2-stage device. Stage 1 is an inhibitor. It can deliver pain sharp on a remote signal to make an animal stop or drop or stand down if a deployment goes wrong and one of them turns on the handlers. Stage 2 is, he stopped. "Say it." "Stage 2 is a cull," Osk said. "One signal, all 5 simultaneous. It stops the heart. It's the failsafe the warhost requires before they'll accept any live Sabren asset near their troops. Every wetted unit that's ever left this facility has had one. It's standard. I'm not telling you it's not monstrous. I'm telling you it's standard." The monitor room hummed. Down on the pen level through the audio feed, Juno's pack made their resting hum, not knowing, 5 hearts with a switch grown into each of them now. "Who holds the signal?" Juno said. "Vantor. And at deployment the field commander. It's coded to a control unit. There are 2, Osk swallowed. One stays with the program, one goes to the field. Juno stood in the doorway for a long moment, and Osk watched her do the arithmetic he had watched her do a dozen times now, quietly and completely, and he watched her reach the bottom of it, which was that the man who had put her here had grown a knife into the throat of everything she loved and kept the handle in his warm office 40 meters up. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said finally, and it was not warm, but it was real, and it landed on Osk like a weight. "You didn't have to. You're the first one here who didn't have to and did anyway. Remember that you were." She turned to go and paused. "The control units. What do they look like?" "Juno." "I'm not going to do anything," she said. "I can't do anything. He's got a switch in their skulls and a bond in their chests, and I've got a bucket. I know exactly what I've got." She looked back at him, and there was that banked color in her eyes again. "I just want to know what the thing looks like that can kill my whole family from across a room. That's not too much to want to know." Osk told her. A control unit was a flat gray slab the size of a Sethin palm, keyed to the holder's genetic signature, dead in any other hand. He told her because he had crossed a line the day he left things out of the profile, and he had found that once you cross that kind of line you keep walking, and because some part of him had decided, without ever quite saying it to himself, whose side he was on. "It won't work in your hand," he added. "Even if you had it, genetic lock, it'd be a dead slab." "I know," Juno said. "I heard you." And she went down to the pens and sat on the floor and hummed to the 5 of them, one seam at a time, as if her voice could reach the thing under the stitches and tell it no. There was a cub in the 9th wedding that Juno could not save, and it taught her more about Karst Hollow than anything Vantor ever said in his warm office. She was not supposed to go near the other litters. Her clearance ran to the 6th wedding and nowhere else. The program kept its conditioners separate so that no bond crossed a cell line and complicated the arithmetic. But she walked the pen level twice a day, to and from her own run, and the corridor ran past a dozen cells, and in one of them, in those weeks before the warhost came, there was a small gray shape that stopped throwing itself at the mesh whenever she passed. The 9th wedding was 3 weeks behind her own, cubs still small enough to lift, still in the middle of what Cole had been pulled out of. Their handler was a career man named Vresk who ran his floor the way Korik ran his, with the goad and the past-the-line ration and the smell of blood in the vents, and he was, by the program's own numbers, good at it. His litter was wetting fast, going wire-tight and wall-eyed and savage right on schedule. All but one. There was a runt in the 9th, the way there was always a runt, and it was not wetting, and Vresk had it marked non-responsive, and Juno knew exactly what that meant and exactly how many days it had. She started slowing when she passed the cell. That was all she let herself do at first. She would slow and drop her eyes and make herself low and unhurried, and hum the low keeping sound under her breath as she went by. And by the 4th day the little gray runt had stopped slamming the mesh when she passed and started pressing itself against the wire to be near the sound. "You can't," Osk told her low, catching her at it on the 5th day. He was not scolding, he looked ill. "Juno, that's Vresk's litter. You're not cleared, and even if you were, it's marked. It goes to the drawer at the turn of the cycle. Vresk has already logged it. There's nothing." "I know what's logged," Juno said. She did not stop humming. Through the mesh the little runt had gone quiet and loose, ember eyes half-lit, the way coal went half-lit under her hand, and it was the first quiet that cub had probably known in its whole short screaming life. "I'm not going to save it. I know I can't save it. I've got 5 in a bargain and no leverage, and I'm not going to spend the run of the 9th to lose the whole of the 6th. I did that arithmetic the first day I ever did any arithmetic here." Her voice stayed level and her jaw did not. "But it's got 3 days, and it's spent its whole life so far being hurt by every tall shape it ever met, and I can stand here for 2 minutes twice a day and let it know that isn't the whole of what the world is. That's not saving it. That's the least. That's the actual least a person can do, so I'm going to do the least." Osk stood with her a while in the corridor, and did not report it, and added leaving that out to the growing column of true things he was learning to keep off the record. The drawer came at the turn of the cycle, the way it was logged too. Juno was made to be elsewhere. She was always made to be elsewhere for the drawers. They had learned that much about her. And when she came back down the corridor, the cell of the 9th wedding had one fewer number in it. And the little gray runt that had learned, in its last 3 days, that a hand and a hum did not have to mean pain, was gone into the cold with everything it had just started to learn still in it. Juno stood in front of the empty stretch of mesh for a long moment. She did not cry in the corridor where the Sethan could see. She went down to her own run instead, and she sat on the floor inside the mesh with her 5, and Cole came and put his enormous head in her lap, and Bracken backed his warm weight against her spine, and the resting hum came up around her, and only there, with her face in Cole's fur, did she let it go. "There's 100 cells on this level," she said into the fur, so low the microphones lost it. 100 numbers. "And I got 5 of you out because a clever man wanted to weaponize the way I sit on a floor, and the rest of them get Vresk and the goad and the drawer, and there's nothing I can do about it, and I'm going to carry every one of them the rest of my life." Her hand moved on Cole's neck, over the healing seam, over the switch grown into him. "I'm not telling you because you understand the words. I'm telling you because somebody should say it out loud in this place one time that they were real. That the 9th's runt was real, that it learned right at the end that a hand could be a kind thing, and then they put it in a drawer. The hum ran through the 5 of them, warm and low and whole. I'm going to remember it. Somebody's going to remember it. That's the least. I'll find a way to do more than the least if I ever get the room. But somebody is going to remember there were 100 cells, and that only 5 got out, and that the rest of them were real." She did not know, saying it, that she was making a promise she would one day stand in front of a warhost and force her to keep. She only knew she could not stop hearing the other cells. Neither after that day could Osk. The warhost came at the turn of the season, and the warhost was not what Juno expected, and that mattered more than anyone at Karst Hollow yet understood. Osk saw them duck. He was on the upper gantry when the delegation's cutter mated to the station ring, and he watched them come off it, and he felt the old cast thing move in him, the reflex his kind had toward the warhost, which was not fear exactly but the deep pull a lesser current feels toward a greater. The overwatchers ran the programs. But the warhost was the Sethan, the old caste, the fighting caste, the ones who had carried the species up out of 100 wars, and they carried themselves like it, unhurried and enormous and entirely without the nervous cleverness of Vantor's kind. At their head came a warhost named Saravu. She was old for the warhost, which meant she was very old indeed, plating gone nearly white, one eye milked over by an old wound she had never bothered to have fixed, and she walked the gantry the way weather walks a ridge, and where she passed, overwatchers stopped what they were doing without deciding to. She had not come to be impressed. Osk saw that at once. She had buried 2 years of warhost dead on the Vel Reach, and she had come to the edge of nowhere to look at the thing the clever caste swore would end it. And she had come already prepared to find it wanting, because she had seen a great many things the clever caste swore by, and buried the young that trusted them. Vantor met her with exactly the right amount of deference, which was a great deal. "Warhost, the 6th wedding is our most advanced asset, fully bonded, fully directional, steady under live fire conditioning. I believe it will answer every doubt the host has carried about this program." He gestured toward the observation gallery over the demonstration dome. "If you'll permit me to show you what a properly conditioned sabren can do." Saravu looked at him with her one good eye for a while, and then past him, down through the gantry grating, to the pen level far below, where a small human shape in a too-big coat sat on the floor of a corridor with 5 apex predators lying around her like a hearth, and where, even at that distance, even through grating and cold air, and the noise of a docking ring, a subsonic hum rose that the warhost felt in the old wound of her chest before she heard it in her ears. That is the conditioner, Saravu said, the primate. A contract worker, Vantor said. The bond forms most readily with a non-threat presence. We have refined the method, too. I did not ask about your method. Saravu kept looking down at the human and the pack. Osk, standing near enough to hear, watched the old warrior's face and could not read it, and that itself was information, because Osk could read most faces and the warhost had faces built to be unread. Show me your demonstration, overwatcher, Saravu said at last. In the morning. I have crossed a long dark to see it. It had better be worth the crossing. She turned and went to her quarters, and Vantor allowed himself, alone in the lift, one long exhalation of a man whose 2 years of failure were about to become one morning of success. And down on the pen level Juno Hale sat with her family and hummed, and did not yet know that the old white warrior had looked at her for a long time, and had felt the hum in her chest, and had thought, though she told no one then, that in 50 years of war she had never once seen an animal orient on a handler like a compass orients on the pole, and that whatever the clever caste believed it had not built that had grown, and things that grow have roots, and roots do not let go when you pull. Juno did not sleep the night before the demonstration. She sat with the pack instead, on the floor of their run, inside the mesh for once. A privilege Vantor had granted her weeks ago, because a trigger that goes into the cage builds a better bond, and she had taken the privilege knowing exactly why it was given and using it anyway, because she would take any hour with them she could get and did not care whose ledger it went in. Cole lay with his head across her legs. Bracken had backed his great warm bulk against her spine, the way he had since he was small enough to do it without folding her over. Sedge and Reed and Marrow lay in a loose ring, facing outward from her the way they always faced outward now, and the resting hum ran through all of them and through her, 5 hearts and a small human one, and if she pressed her palm to Cole's neck she could feel, under the fur and the healing seam, the place where the switch was. I've been thinking about how it goes, she told them, very low in the dark of the cold cycle when no handler was on the floor. You don't understand the words and it doesn't matter. I've been thinking about it. He's going to take you out there tomorrow in front of the old white one and he's going to make you show them what you can do, and you can do it. I know you can. You do anything I pointed you at. That's the whole rotten trick of it. And then they're going to want to send you away from me to a war, to be dropped on people who never did anything to you, with a knife grown into your neck so they can stop your hearts if you ever stop being useful. Her hand moved on Cole's fur. I'm not going to let that happen. I don't know yet how I'm not going to let it happen, but I raised you steady and I raised you free, and I am not going to hand you to a man who thinks free is a defect he can cut out. So whatever happens out there tomorrow, you watch my hands, not their voices, not their goads. My hands, only ever my hands. You've always watched my hands. Watch them tomorrow like nothing else in the world exists. 5 great heads, the resting hum, 10 ember eyes half lit in the dark. They did not understand the words. They understood her. That had always been the whole of it. The demonstration dome sat out on the ice a half-kilometer from the main station, a pressurized hemisphere over a strip of made ground, Vantor's mock battlefield, the scent-mapped conquered soil, the armored dummies, the target drones, the whole theater of it. The observation gallery ran along one curved wall behind blast glass, raised, so the watchers looked down on the ground the way gods and generals prefer to. Saravu took the center of it. Her warhost officers ranged behind her, huge and still. Vantor stood at her shoulder with a slate and a control unit. Osk saw the flat gray slab in the overwatcher's hand and felt his stomach drop, because Vantor did not usually carry it himself. And a man carries the failsafe when a man expects he might use it. Osk had a place at the console bank below the gallery, running the recording, which meant he had in front of him the second control unit, the field unit. It sat in its cradle in the console, dead gray, keyed to Vantor's signature and the field commander's, a dead slab in any other hand. Osk looked at it once and made himself look away and did his job. They brought the pack out through the airlock tunnel with Juno walking at the center of them, and the whole gallery of warhost officers went quiet. They had all seen sabren. Most of them had seen wedded sabren, had, on the Vel Reach, seen the earlier program's failures dropped on enemy ground, seen the savage undirected things tear apart a position and then tear apart the transport that came to recover them. They knew what a wedded sabren looked like, wire-tight, wall-eyed, foaming at the killing edge. What came out of the airlock tunnel onto the made ground did not look like that. 5 adult sabren in their prime, mantles high and glossy, moving with the loose, unhurried economy of animals that have never once been afraid, and at the center of them a small human female in a coat too big for her, and the 5 of them turning when she turned and stopping when she stopped, not because she commanded them but because she was the center and they were the circumference, and the subsonic hum rose off the whole formation and filled the dome. And every warhost officer in that gallery felt it in the old animal floor of their spines, and none of them said a word. Saravu leaned forward very slightly. That was all. But Vantor, who had learned to read the warhost in a day, saw the lean and knew he had her attention and began. Warhost. What you're seeing is full anchor integration. The conditioner is the pack's fixed reference. Through her, the asset accepts direction with total reliability and zero handler risk. He touched his slate. Out on the ground, a bank of target drones lit and began to move, Concord-scented, evasive, fast, the way real infantry moved. Observe. Down on the made ground, Juno stood in the cold false light and knew this was the part where she taught a general that her family was a gun. She had turned it over all night and found no way around it. If she balked now in the first minute, Vantor would simply have her removed, thumb the inhibitor to drop the pack into pain, and run the demonstration through the control unit alone, cruder, but enough to sell, and with her removed from the board and the runt's life still in a drawer somewhere waiting. No, she could not spend her one refusal on the drones. She had to save it. She had to let them see the weapon so that when she finally refused, the refusal would land where it mattered and not before. So she lifted her hand and swept it toward the drones, the sign for look there, and then closed it into the fist that meant hold, then opened 2 fingers go and her family went. It was the most beautiful and terrible thing Osk Rimet ever saw. They did not swarm. Wedded sabren swarmed, a chaos of teeth. The 6th wedding hunted, the way she had let them grow up able to hunt, as a pack, as one animal with 5 bodies, bracken driving and sedge cutting off the escape, and coal and reed and marrow folding the drones inward against the dome wall. And they took the drones out of the air one after another, clean, fast, no wasted motion. And where a drone went down, a sabren was already turning to the next because Juno's hand had already swept to the next. And in 90 seconds, the made ground was littered with the wreckage of a dozen evasive targets, and not one sabren had taken a scratch, and not one had lost the thread of the small human hand that moved them like a conductor moves a storm. The gallery of warhost officers made a sound. Not applause, the warhost did not applaud, but a low collective exhalation. The sound of hard old soldiers who have just seen the answer to 2 years of buried dead and cannot quite believe the clever cast finally delivered it. Vantor did not smile, but Osk, watching him, saw the overwatcher's shoulders come down a fraction, the release of a man who has just watched his life's wager pay. Directional lethality against evasive targets, Vantor said. Reliable, repeatable, zero handler casualties, and fully fail-safed. He held up the control unit so the warhost could see it. If the asset should ever turn, which it will not, the host holds the switch. Every unit carries a cranial implant, inhibitor and cull on a coded signal. You will never field a sabren you cannot stop. That is the promise this program makes that the last one could not. Saravu looked at the control unit in his hand, and then down at the pack on the ground, now flowing back to gather around the human, mantles settling, the resting hum coming up as they pressed against her, Cole shoving his great head under her arm, and her small hand coming up to scratch under his chin without her seeming to think about it. In the middle of a war demonstration, in front of the assembled warhost, the way a person touches a thing they love. The warhost was quiet for a long moment. "It is a fine weapon, overwatcher," Saravu said at last. "Finer than I came expecting. You have earned the host's attention." A pause. "Now show me the rest of it." Vantor went still. "Warhost, you have shown me it can kill a drone." Saravu turned her one good eye on him, and there was nothing warm in it, and nothing cruel either, only the flat, terrible practicality of someone who has sent the young to die and needs to know exactly what she is buying before she buys more of it. "A drone is a machine. My enemy is not a machine, and neither, I am told, is your asset. I have watched wedded sabren tear apart a drone range and then refuse the transport home. I need to see this one kill a living thing on command in cold blood at the handler's direction, and then walk away steady and get in the box. That is the demonstration I crossed the dark for, Overwatcher. Not the toy hunt, the real thing. Or do you not have it in you to show me?" And there it was, and Osk saw Vantor's whole face do a small thing, and understood that Vantor had wanted to avoid exactly this. Had built the drone hunt precisely so he would not have to do the other thing in front of the human, and that the warhost, who had buried 2 years of dead and trusted nothing the clever cast said, had walked him straight into it anyway. "We have a live target available," Vantor said, after a beat that was a fraction too long. "A conquered prisoner, recovered from a courier weeks ago. It has been held for this purpose." He had never told Juno that. Down on the ground, Juno's hand went still on Cole's chin. They brought the prisoner out through a side lock, and the whole shape of the morning changed. It was a conquered scout, and the conquered were not, whatever the program's scent maps implied, monsters. The scout was a slight bipedal thing with dun feathers matted from weeks in a cell and its 4 eyes blinking against the demonstration light, and its legs did not work well, from the cell or from something worse, so that the 2 handlers half carried it out onto the made ground and set it down in the middle of the scent-mapped soil and backed away fast. It sat where they put it. It did not run. There was nowhere to run to inside a pressure dome full of sabren, and it seemed to know that, and it folded its thin arms over its head in a gesture that needed no translation. Juno looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at the gallery, at Vantor's flat pewter face behind the blast glass, and she understood that he had kept a living person in a drawer for weeks against exactly this morning, and had never once mentioned it to her, and had meant all along for her hand to be the thing that pointed her family at it. "Conditioner," Vantor's voice came down over the dome speakers, even and unhurried. "Direct the asset to the target, standard engagement, then recover the pack and stand down." A pause. "The warhost is watching. Show her what you built." Down on the ground, in the cold false light, Juno Hale did the only thing she had left to do, the thing she had done 31 days and a lifetime ago in a wedding pit, the thing this whole story had always been walking toward. She sat down. She walked to the center of the made ground, to the place between her pack and the folded shivering scout, and she lowered herself all the way to the false soil, flat, legs folded, hands loose and open and empty in her lap, and she made herself the smallest and lowest and least dangerous thing under the dome, and she put herself directly in the line between the weapon and the target, and she did not lift her hand. "Conditioner." Vantor's voice did not change, which was how Osk, at his console, knew the Overwatcher was afraid. "That is not the instruction. Direct the asset to the target." "No," Juno said. She did not shout it. The dome microphones barely caught it. But the gallery of warhost officers heard it, and Saravu heard it, and the pack heard it. 5 great heads swinging from the folded prisoner to their anchor sitting empty-handed on the ground, and the resting hum guttered and changed. "I raised them steady," Juno said to the gallery, to the general, to the man in the warm office who had grown knives into their necks. Her voice stayed level. You wanted a weapon that was savage to your enemy and steady to you. I never built that. I couldn't build that because it isn't a real thing, and if you'd ever once come down out of your office and sat on the floor, you'd know it isn't a real thing. There's no such animal as one that'll kill on a stranger's word and love on a friend's. There's just love and where you point it. And I never pointed it at anything but keeping them alive. So no, I'm not going to raise my hand. That thing on the ground never did anything to me or mine, and I'm not going to teach my family that a pointing finger is a reason to kill because the next finger might point at each other or at some cadet or at me. No, recover your prisoner. The demonstration's over. The dome was very quiet. Then Vantor thumbed the inhibitor. Osk saw him do it, saw the overwatcher's gray finger move on the flat gray slab, and a half-second later down on the ground, all 5 sabren dropped. It was terrible. The inhibitor did what it was built to do, which was to deliver a spike of pure pain to the base of 5 skulls at once, enough to fold an adult sabren mid-stride, and they went down as one, mantles slamming flat, ember eyes blowing wide, and the sound that came out of them was a sound Juno had never heard from them and would hear in her sleep the rest of her life. A high tearing shriek with nothing of the hum in it. The sound the whole wedding program had been trying to wring out of them their whole lives and had never gotten, and Vantor got it in half a second with his thumb. Juno was up on her knees before she knew she'd moved. "Stop it. Direct the asset to the target," Vantor said over the speakers, over the shrieking, still even, still unhurried, and now Osk understood the whole cold shape of the plan and felt sick with it. The inhibitor releases when the instruction is followed. It is very simple, conditioner. They hurt until you point, and they stop hurting. You are not being asked to be cruel. You are being asked to end their pain. Lift your hand. It was, Osk would think later, the most purely evil thing he ever watched a person do, and it was done in a reasonable voice, which was the evil of it. Vantor had built a machine that turned Juno's love into the lever that worked her, that made her family scream until she used them, that put the pain on them and the guilt on her and the clean gray slab in his own untouched hand. And it almost worked. Osk saw it almost work. He saw Juno's hand come up off her lap shaking, because she could not stand the sound, because every scream was coal and bracken and sedge and reed and marrow, and she would have cut off her own arm to make it stop, and her hand rose toward the sign that would end it, and the pack would go, and the scout would die, and Vantor would have his weapon and his warhost and his war, and it would all have been bought with one lifted human hand. Her hand stopped in the air, because down on the ground, in the middle of the pain, in the middle of the shrieking, Cole had lifted his head. The inhibitor was still firing. Osk could see Vantor's thumb still on the slab, and it should not have been possible. The device was rated to fold an adult sabren flat and hold it there, and Cole lifted his great head up off the false soil against all of it, ember eyes streaming, jaws parted on that tearing shriek, and he did not look at the prisoner. He looked at Juno. He found her frozen, half-raised hand and her white face, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the wedding pit when he was small enough to lift, and he did the thing that broke the entire program in half. He stopped shrieking, and through the pain, low and ragged and barely there, he began to hum. And one by one, folded flat under a spike of agony built to make them scream, the pack answered him. Bracken, jaw grinding into the soil, took up the hum, then sedge, then reed and marrow. 5 sabren pinned to the ground by a machine designed to break them, choosing out of the very center of the pain to make the one sound that had never once been about killing, the resting hum, the keeping sound, the thing that meant you are safe and I am here and we are one animal, choosing to make it toward the small human on her knees rather than to make the killing shriek toward the prisoner 10 meters away. Juno's hand came down, not into the sign, onto the ground. She crawled to Cole through the false soil and put both her arms around his streaming, shuddering, humming head and pressed her forehead to his and hummed back, broken, sobbing into the fur. while the inhibitor fired and her family lay in a ring around her, and hummed through their agony because being near her was worth more to them than the absence of pain. Up in the gallery, Warhost Saravu of the Sethian warhost watched a weapon refuse, under maximum control signal, to be a weapon, watched it choose, in extremis, love over the lever built into its skull, and she turned her one good eye slowly onto overwatcher Vantor, and her voice when it came was very quiet and very old. "Take your thumb off the slab, overwatcher." Vantor did not. His composure had a crack in it now, the first Osk had ever seen. Warhost, the asset is non-compliant. The failsafe is functioning exactly as designed. Give me a moment and it will. "It will what?" Saravu said. "It will point. Look at it, Overwatcher. It is not going to point. You have driven it to the edge of your machine's ability to hurt it, and it is lying in a ring around the primate singing to her. That is not a weapon that has failed to obey. That is a weapon that has chosen, and you have shown me very clearly in front of my whole host that the one thing your failsafe cannot do is make it choose you." Her plating had not moved. Her voice had not risen. It did not need to. "Take your thumb off the slab. You are hurting them for nothing, and I do not buy weapons from men who hurt things for nothing, because a man who will do that with a Warhost watching will do worse with no one watching, and I have enough of my dead to bury without adding the ones your temper loses me. Off, now." Vantor took his thumb off the slab. Down on the ground the shrieking stopped, the inhibitor released. 5 sabren lay shaking in the aftermath, ribs heaving, and the resting hum wavered and steadied, and came back up around the small shape at their center, and Juno lifted her wet face out of Cole's fur, and looked up at the gallery, at Saravu, at the general who had just called her family a weapon that chose, and something passed between the old white warrior and the young human across all that cold air and blast glass that neither of them would ever put into words. But Vantor was not finished. Men like Vantor are never finished. That is what makes them dangerous long past the point they should be. He had lost the Warhost's approval. He could feel it going, 2 years of work bleeding out of the morning. And something in the clever cold engine of him decided that if he could not sell the weapon as controllable, he would at least prove it was his, that the switch was real, that the primate and her singing pack could be ended by his hand any time he chose, and that a thing you can end is a thing you own. His thumb moved on the slab again, but not to the inhibitor. Osk at the console saw the readout change, and his blood went to water. "He's arming the cull," Osk said out loud to no one, to the console, to himself. "He's arming the cull." The cull did not travel from Vantor's hand to the pack's next by magic. Osk knew the schematics better than anyone alive except the man who'd drawn them, because Osk had spent 4 months signing off on their maintenance. The control unit generated the signal, keyed to Vantor's signature, dead in any other hand. That much was true, that much could not be faked or borrowed. But the implants under those healing seams were short-range receivers. They could not hear a slab across a dome. The signal had to be thrown to them, amplified, broadcast, and inside the demonstration dome it was thrown by one relay, one transmitter node, wired into the console bank, 6 inches from Osk Remez's right hand. Osk did not decide to do it any more than Juno had decided to walk down a ladder 31 days ago. He had been deciding it, he realized, for weeks. Every truth he left out of a profile, every schematic he studied twice, every night he lay awake with the word aiming under the lid of his mind. The deciding was already done. All that was left was the hand. He tore the relay node out of the console. It did not come easily. It was seated and shielded and meant to stay, and he put his whole young weight into it and felt something in the mounting give, and then felt the node come free in a spray of sparks and torn fiber. And he stood there holding a dead broadcast transmitter and a fistful of his own severed career, while up in the gallery Overwatcher Vantor pressed his thumb down on the cull command and killed his pack. Nothing happened. 5 sabren went on breathing in their ring around the human. The cull signal generated and reached the relay and reached a hole where the relay had been, and died there, 6 inches from Osk's hand, and did not travel the last 30 meters to the seams under the mantles. Vantor pressed it again. His composure was entirely gone now. Osk could see the overwatcher's gray hand shaking on the slab, could see the flat vertical pupils blown wide, could see 2 years of control coming apart in real time in front of the assembled warhost. He pressed the cull a 3rd time, and a 4th, thumbing death into a dead line, and each time the pack went on breathing, and each time the thing he had told the warhost was the whole promise of his program. You will never field a sabren you cannot stop, became more visibly, more publicly, more completely a lie. Overwatcher, Saravu said. She had not moved. What are you doing with your thumb? Vantor looked up from the slab, and for one moment the mask was entirely off, and every warhost officer in that gallery saw the naked thing under it. Not a cold engineer, not a patient builder, just a small furious man who had been humiliated by a primate and a pack of animals, and could not bear it, who would rather destroy the only working asset in the program than watch it choose someone else, who was at the bottom of all his calm. Exactly the kind of man the warhost had spent 2 years dying because of. The failsafe is malfunctioning, Vantor said. Someone has. He looked down at the console bank, at Osk standing there holding the torn relay in a fist, and his face did a thing Osk had never seen it do. You little. It's not malfunctioning, Overwatcher, Osk said. His voice shook and he let it shake and said it anyway loud so the gallery would hear, so the recording he was still technically running would catch it. It's working perfectly. You just tried to cull the whole litter because a girl told you no, in front of the warhost. I cut the relay. The signal's dead. They're alive because I cut the relay and I'd cut it again. And that was the moment it all turned, and it turned on the smallest thing, the way these things do. Because Vantor, unmade, humiliated, out of arguments and out of switches, did the one thing his whole cold life had trained him never to do. He lost his temper with his hands. He came down the gallery steps 2 at a time, past the warhost officers who did not stop him, because the warhost does not intervene in another caste's disgrace until it is asked to, and he came out through the observation lock onto the made ground itself, and he crossed the false soil toward the small human kneeling in the ring of her exhausted pack, and he drew back his gray-plated hand to strike the trigger, the anchor, the primate who had cost him everything. To hurt the one thing his machines could no longer hurt for him. He never landed the blow. The pack had been folded flat, wrung out, shaking in the aftermath of an agony built to break them. It did not matter. A tall shape drew back its hand over their anchor, and 600 million years came up off the false soil at once. Osk did not even see them move. One instant 5 sabren lay spent in a ring. The next instant Overwatcher Vantor was on his back on the made ground with Bracken's full weight on his chest, and Bracken's jaws closed around the base of his throat. Not biting, just closed, holding. The way Bracken had once closed his jaws on a charged goad and bitten it in half. And Cole stood over the Overwatcher's legs, and sedge and reed and marrow made a wall around all of it facing outward, facing the gallery, facing the handlers, facing the whole apparatus of the program that had grown knives into their necks, and every one of them was making the low, grinding rockfall hum, and it filled the dome, and not one Sethian in that place, warhost or Overwatcher, so much as breathed. Vantor lay very still under the jaws he had built and could no longer switch off. His slate had skittered away across the soil. His control unit lay beside it, a dead gray slab, useless in his hand and useless out of it. The whole promise of his life reduced to a rectangle on the ground that could kill no one because a junior with soft opinions had torn out a relay, and a pack of weapons had chosen a girl. Bracken, Juno said. She had gotten to her feet. She stood in the ring of her pack, small and wrung out and streaked with the false soil and her own dried tears, and her voice was not loud, and it did not shake any more. Bracken, hold. And she lifted her hand and closed it into a fist. Bracken held. His jaws stayed exactly where they were, closed and unbiting around the throat of the man who had spent 2 years trying to turn him into a thing that would bite on command. And he did not bite, because the small human hand had made the sign for hold, and there was no signal in any slab in any hand in the galaxy that could override that sign, because it did not run on a switch. It ran on the thing the whole program had failed for 2 years to install, and had never understood was not installable. It ran on love, and where she pointed it, and she had never once in her life pointed it at killing, and she did not point it there now. You built it backwards, Juno said, looking down at Vantor over the top of Bracken's mantled shoulder. Her voice carried in the silent dome. I told you you did. You wanted them steady to you and savage to your enemy, and you spent 100 litters and 100 drawers trying to cut it into their necks, and it was never there to cut. There's no such animal. There's just what you love and where you point it. I love them and they love me, and I am never going to point them at a bound stranger to sell you a war. That's the whole thing. That's all it ever was. And you had a switch in your office that could stop their hearts, and you thumbed it 4 times this morning because a nobody said no to you. And the only reason you're breathing right now is that I raised them better than you'd have let me, and I'm telling this one to hold. She crouched slow, telegraphed, no surprises, and laid her hand flat along Bracken's straining shoulder, over the muscle over the mantle, and she brought her voice down into the low, tuneless keeping sound, her grandmother's hum, the sound she'd made in a cold pit over a cub that threw itself at walls, and she poured it into Bracken until the grinding rockfall hum in his chest wavered and dropped, degree by degree, back down into the resting hum. Easy, she murmured. Easy, off, he's not worth the drawer. Off now for me, only ever for me. And Bracken opened his jaws and stepped off the overwatcher's chest and turned his back on him. The deepest contempt a predator can show a thing, to decide it is not worth watching, and went to the human and pressed his great head against her and hummed. Warhost Saravu had watched a great many endings in her long life, and she knew the difference between a thing that was over and a thing that had merely paused. And as she came down the gallery steps onto the made ground, she understood that this was the second kind. She had her officers take Vantor. He did not resist. He had gone somewhere behind his own eyes, the place broken men go, and 2 warhost troopers walked him off the false soil past the pack that did not deign to watch him leave. And Saravu did not waste another moment on him, because a warhorse does not spend her attention on the disgraced when the undecided is standing right in front of her. The undecided was a small human female, filthy with false soil and dried salt, standing in a ring of 5 apex predators inside a demonstration dome on the coldest edge of the Sethin Reach, and she did not look away when the oldest and most dangerous soldier in 3 systems walked up to her. And that, more than anything else that morning, decided Saravu. They should have removed you from that pit 31 days ago, Saravu said. You know that. The one you called Vantor knew it. Instead, he built his whole war around a contract primate with a bucket because he was clever, and clever men mistake the lever for the load. She looked at the pack, at the way it held its shape around the human without being told, at the resting hum she could feel in the old wound of her chest. I have led the warhost for 40 years. I have handled war beasts on 9 fronts. I have never seen an animal do what these did this morning. Do you understand what they did? Under maximum inhibitor signal, pain built to fold them flat and hold them there, they lifted their heads and sang to you. That is not conditioning. That is not a trick your overwatcher taught them. That is a thing I did not know was in the universe to be done. Her one good eye moved over Juno's plain, wrung-out face. What is your name, primate? Your real one, not your unit number. I have had enough of numbers this morning. Juno Hale. Juno Hale. Saravu said it the way she'd say a coordinate she meant to remember. Here is what I have decided, Juno Hale, and I will say it plainly because you have earned plain. My host is bleeding on the Vel Reach. 2 years, and every clever thing the Overwatcher cast sent me broke in my hands or turned in my hands or died in the drop. And this morning I have watched the first war beast in the history of this program that is steady and coordinated and lethal and utterly reliable, and reliable to exactly one thing in creation, which is you. She let that stand. I could order it. You are a bond-held contract worker on a facility that does not exist. I could put you and your 5 on a warhost cutter tonight and take you to the front, and you would come, because they will follow you and you will follow them, and I would have the weapon that ends my war. I could do that. Tell me why I should not. Around Juno, the resting hum did not change, because the pack did not understand the words. But Juno understood them, and Osk, standing now at the edge of the made ground with the torn relay still in his hand, understood them, and the cold came up through the false soil into all of them, because the terrible thing about the good general was that she was still a general, and she had still just looked at a family and seen a weapon, and the only difference between her and Vantor was that she would ask first. Juno was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Because it wouldn't work and you already know it wouldn't, or you'd have ordered it instead of asking." Saravu waited. "You saw what they did this morning," Juno said. "You said it yourself. Under a machine built to break them, they chose me over the pain. You think they'd do that on the Vel Reach and not do it everywhere else? You'd point me at your enemies' tender places, and I'd point them and they'd go, because they'd go anywhere I pointed. And the first time one of your troopers raised a hand near me, or the first time a drop went wrong and I got hurt, or the first time you needed me to send them somewhere I wouldn't send my own family, you'd have exactly what Vantor had. A weapon that only fires for love, and a switch in its neck for when love says no, and sooner or later somebody thumbs the switch, because somebody always thumbs the switch. You wouldn't be buying a weapon that ends your war first. You'd be buying my grief on a delay, and I'd rather die on this ice tonight than raise them steady and free just to hand them to one more person who calls them an asset." She was not shouting. She never shouted. "You want to know why you shouldn't order it? Because you're not Vantor. That's the only reason there is, and it's enough if you're the soldier the old wound in your chest says you are. It's enough." The dome was very quiet. Saravu looked at her for a long time with her one good eye, and Osk, who had spent his life learning to read faces the warhost built to be unread, could not read hers, and understood that this was the most important silence of his young life, and that he had no idea which way it would break. "There is still a switch in their necks," Saravu said at last. It was not an answer. It was a fact laid on the table between them. 5 cull implants, stage 2, and a second control unit, the field unit, that this morning's disgrace does not unkey. It is still coded to Vantor's signature and to a field commander's. Vantor is finished, but his signature is not deleted by his disgrace, and his caste does not love the warhost, and this facility is full of overwatchers who watched an animal humiliate their program in front of me and who will want, very badly, for that recording to say something other than what it says. Her plating shifted. "Your 5 are alive tonight because a junior tore out a relay. That is not a plan, Juno Hale. That is luck, and luck is a thing I have watched bury more of my young than the enemy ever did. There are people on this station tonight who would very much like your pack to have a quiet accident before the host formalizes anything, and a dead relay in a dome does not stop a signal sent from a maintenance panel next to the pens." She turned toward the observation lock. "Which is why nothing is decided tonight, and why you will not sleep in those pens tonight, and neither will I." It was Osk who first understood what she meant, because Osk knew the building. The field control unit, the second slab, was not in the dome. It had never been in the dome. It lived in the program's secure locker on the pen level, in the medical wing, 3 doors from the implant surgery where 5 seams had been cut into 5 necks while Juno was made to be elsewhere. Vantor was in a warhost holding cell, but Vantor's signature was still live in the system, and Vantor had built the program, and a man who builds a program builds it with people who owe him, and the program's chief medical overwatcher, a cold, clever thing named Delth, owed Vantor for a career. Osk found the field unit's locker empty at the second hour of the cold cycle, and stood in front of it with his heart going, and then ran. He ran through corridors he had walked for 4 months, past the younger litters screaming in their cells, past the wetting floor where 100 cubs had been broken toward the drawers, and he burst into the monitor room where Juno had been moved under a warhost guard for the night, with the pack in the adjoining run behind reinforced mesh, and he could barely get the words out. Delth has the field unit, it's gone from the locker. He can send the call from anywhere on the pen level, from a maintenance panel, a medbay terminal, anywhere with a relay, and the pen level's full of relays. I can't tear them all out, there's 40 of them. He caught the door frame. He's going to cull them tonight, before the warhost formalizes anything. He's going to make the recording a lie. A dead asset can't have chosen anyone. If the pack's dead by morning, it's just 5 animals that failed a demonstration, and Vantor's disgrace is a malfunction, not a crime, and the whole cast closes ranks. Juno was already up. So was the warhost trooper on the door, a slab-shouldered young officer named Sevik who had been told by the warhost herself to keep the human alive and had taken it, as the warhost took all such orders, as a thing worth his life. "Where is he?" Juno said. "I don't know, medical maybe. He doesn't need to be near them, that's the point. He just needs a terminal and Vantor's key in 30 seconds. Osk's voice cracked. "Juno, I can't stop a signal I can't find. The relay trick worked in the dome because there was one relay. Down here there's 40 and he can bounce it through any of them. There's no relay to pull." And Juno Hale, who was not simple whatever the Sethin thought, who had spent 31 days and 100 cold nights doing quiet, complete arithmetic in a place that never once expected her to, looked at the reinforced mesh between herself and her family, and looked at the young warhost trooper with a life he'd bet on her, and did the sum, and reached the bottom of it. "You can't stop the signal," she agreed. "So we don't stop the signal, we stop the man, and we do it before he finds a terminal." She was already moving toward the mesh, toward the hum, toward the 5 great shapes rising in the dark of the run to meet her. "Osk, can you get me pen-level access, all of it? Every door?" Yes, my clearance still." "Then open my family's door," Juno said, "and pray Delth slower than he is clever." Chief Medical Overwatcher Delth had performed the implant surgery on 900 sabren over the life of the program, and he did not think of himself as a cruel being. He thought of himself as a professional. Cruelty was Vantor's department, the loud part, the weddings and the drawers. Delth's part was quiet and clean and surgical, a seam at the base of a skull, a receiver, a switch, done under anesthetic, done well. He took a craftsman's pride in it. And when he understood, near the first hour of the cold cycle, exactly what that primate's recording was going to do to the program he had given 30 years to, when he understood that a warhost had watched an animal choose a human over the failsafe, and that the whole cast standing on this station was about to become a matter of warhost record, he took the field control unit out of its locker with steady hands and went to end the problem the clean way, the surgical way. The way that would make the recording a footnote about 5 animals that failed and died. He did not go to the pens. That was the elegance of it. He went the other way, deeper into the medical wing, to a quiet diagnostic bay with a maintenance terminal and a relay node in the ceiling, 3 sealed doors and 40 meters of corridor from where the pack slept, and he sat down at the terminal and keyed in Vantor's signature, which he had, because a man who builds a program builds it with people who owe him, and he began to route the call signal. It was going to take him 90 seconds. He had 90 seconds. Nothing living could cross 40 meters and 3 sealed doors in 90 seconds. He had performed the implant surgery on 900 sabren. He had never once thought about the fact that he had never seen one hunt. Osk opened the run. He did it from the monitor room console, his hands flying, dumping his whole junior clearance into the pen-level door network, and the reinforced mesh between Juno and her family rolled up into the ceiling, and 5 adult sabren came out of the dark run into the corridor and gathered around the small human as if they had been poured there, and the resting hum came up. And then, when Juno began to move, it changed. She did not run. Osk would remember that. In the moment when running was everything, she did not run, because a pack that runs scatters, and a pack that scatters is 5 animals, and she needed 1 animal with 5 bodies. She walked, fast and low and certain, out into the pen-level corridor, and she lifted her hand and swept it down the length of the hall, the sign for look there, that way, and she said 1 word. Find him. They did not know the words. They knew her hand, and they knew her fear, and they knew, the way the pack had always known things she never taught them, that somewhere in the cold dark of this place that had always wanted to hurt them, there was a tall shape reaching for the switch in their necks. Sabren hunted by scent, and by the shared low hum that let them move as one mind across 100 meters of ground, and they spread down the corridor in the wedge Juno had never drilled into them because she had never needed to. Bracken at the point and sedge and coal at the flanks and reed and marrow sweeping the doors, and the human moved at the center of the wedge where the anchor belonged, and the whole formation flowed down the pen level like water finding the crack. And the hum they made now was the low, grinding rockfall hum, and it went ahead of them down the corridors, and in the cells they passed the broken wedding cubs went silent and pressed themselves flat, because even a broken thing knows the sound of the real thing coming. In the diagnostic bay, 40 meters and 3 sealed doors away, Chief Medical Overwatcher Delth felt the hum come through the deck plating into the soles of his feet, and did not, for a fatal moment, understand what it was. He understood the first sealed door. It was rated for a wedding-maddened adult, the same as all the pen-level doors, and it had never once been tested by an adult that was not maddened but coordinated, that did not throw itself at the door in a panic but was placed against it, deliberately, by a pack that had spread its weight and chosen its point and driven Bracken's full mass into the lock seam where Sedge's nose had found the weakness, and the door did not fail the way doors fail under panic, all at once. It peeled. Delth heard it peel, a long shriek of tortured alloy from 3 doors down, and he stopped routing the signal and looked at the terminal readout, 60 seconds. He needed 60 more seconds and made himself keep working, because 60 seconds was nothing. 60 seconds was less time than it would take even a hunting pack to cross 2 more sealed doors. It took them 30. Osk watched it on the monitors and did not breathe. He watched the wedge take the second door faster than the first because they had learned the first, watched Cole and Marrow hold the flanking corridors so nothing could come at the human's back, watched Juno move at the center with her hand up and her face white and set, and he watched the little medbay indicator on his console tick from the second door to the third, and he keyed his comm and shouted into the pen level the only thing he could think to shout. DLTH. Delth, it's Remeh, listen to me, don't send it. You send that signal and there is nothing between you and them. Do you hear me? Right now there is a girl between you and them, and the second those animals are dead there is nothing. She is the only reason you are alive. Don't. In the diagnostic bay, 40 seconds from the call, Delth heard the junior's voice crack out of the wall comm, and heard the third door begin to peel, and understood finally and completely and far too late, the thing the entire program had been built by people who had never once seen a sabren hunt, that the switch in their necks had never been the thing keeping the handlers safe. The girl had been the thing keeping the handlers safe. The whole time. Every day. The only wall between the Sethane and the pack they had tortured for 2 years had never been the mesh or the goad or the failsafe. It had been one small human sitting on the floor, teaching 5 apex predators that killing was not a thing you did because a finger pointed, and Delth was about to remove her reason to keep teaching it, from the wrong side of the last door. His hand hovered over the confirmation. 30 seconds of signal routing left, or 1 thumb press to send it raw and unrefined, and certain right now. The third door peeled open. Delph pressed his thumb down, and Juno Hale's voice came through the gap in the ruined door, low and clear and absolutely steady, not to Delph, but to the 5 great shapes pouring through it into the diagnostic bay, and it was the same word she had said in the dome over a man with jaws at his throat, the same word she had built into them across 100 cold nights, the only word that had ever mattered. Hold! Her hand closed into a fist, and the pack held. The cull did not fire. Delph pressed his thumb down on the confirmation and the field unit sent, and the signal went out from the slab into the diagnostic bay's single ceiling relay, and died there, unamplified, unrouted, short of the necks it was meant for by the last 40 meters it could not cross, because in his panic Delph had abandoned the 60 seconds of routing that would have thrown the signal through the whole pen-level relay net, and had pressed it raw instead. And raw, the cull was a shout in an empty room. The implants under 5 mantles were short-range receivers. They heard nothing. The pack went on breathing. Delph understood this in the half-second after he pressed, watching the readout return its flat, cold error, and then he stopped thinking about the readout entirely, because there were 5 adult sabren in the diagnostic bay with him, and they had just watched a tall shape try to stop their hearts, and they were between him and the only door. And the only thing in the universe standing between Chief Medical Overwatcher Delph and the architecture of his own surgeries was a small human female with her hand raised in a fist. He did not move. He had, at last, learned the one thing the whole program had failed to teach him, that the wall was the girl and that he was on the wrong side of her mercy. "You built the switch," Juno said. She stood in the ruined doorway with the pack ranged in front of her, mantles high, the grinding hum filling the little bay, 5 sets of ember eyes fixed on the man at the terminal, and she did not raise her voice, because she never raised her voice, and the not raising was worse than any shout Delph had ever heard. "You cut it into their necks while I was made to be somewhere else. 5 seams. I found them growing back under the fur, and I sat with each one and told it no, like a fool, like that would do anything." Her fist stayed closed. The pack stayed held. "And tonight you took the field unit out of the locker and you came down here in the dark to stop their hearts so a recording would say something other than what it says. And the only reason you are alive right now, the only reason, Delph, there is no other, is the same reason Vantor is alive. It's that I raised them free. It's that the one thing your whole program could never cut into a neck is the one thing I gave them for nothing, sitting on a floor, and it's the thing that's holding these jaws off your throat right now while I decide what kind of person I'm going to be in front of my family." She let that land. "Because they're watching me, Delph. That's the part you never understood, none of you. They watch my hands. Whatever I do right now, they learn it's a thing that's done. So I'm not going to do to you what you came here to do to them, not because you don't deserve the drawer. Because they deserve better than to learn it from me." She lowered her fist slowly and turned it flat, and pressed it to the air the way she pressed it to Bracken's shoulder, and she brought her voice down into the low keeping hum, and the grinding rockfall sound in 5 chests wavered and dropped, degree by degree, back into the resting hum. "Off," she said. "He's not worth it, off now for me." And the pack came off the point and turned its back on Delph, the deepest contempt a predator can show a thing, and flowed back around the human and pressed against her and hummed, and left the chief medical overwatcher standing at his terminal with a dead slab in his hand, and the sudden, total, career-ending understanding that a Warhost's recording had just caught all of it. Because Saravu was in the doorway. She had come down through the peeled doors behind the trooper Tsevik and half a squad of Warhost, moving faster than an animal her age had any right to move, and she had arrived in time to see the last of it, the raised fist, the held pack, the human choosing mercy over the drawer in front of the very beasts everyone swore could not be controlled, and she stood in the ruin of the 3rd door with her one good eye taking in the whole scene, and when she spoke, it was not to Delph, and it was not to Juno. It was to her own officers, and it carried down the corridor, and it was the sound of a very old soldier making a decision she would not unmake. "Record all of it," Saravu said. "The locker log, the signature, the unit in his hand. Every second." She stepped into the bay. "Chief Medical Overwatcher Delph, on the authority of the warhost and before witnesses, you are relieved. You attempted without sanction to destroy a live asset under warhost review to conceal the conduct of your program from the host, using a signature keyed to a man already in my custody. That is not a caste matter anymore. That is a war matter, and it is mine." She held out one broad gray hand. "The field unit, now." Delph put the slab in her hand. His own hands were shaking. Saravu closed her fingers around the dead gray rectangle. The second of the two switches, the field key, the last thing in the universe that could throw a call signal at 5 necks. And she looked at it for a moment, this small thing that had been built to end the only weapon that had ever worked. And then she turned it flat in her palm and considered the pack, and considered the human, and considered 40 years of war and 2 years of buried young, and she made the second decision of the night. "Remeh," she said, without looking away from Juno. "Junior Overwatcher Remeh, you tore out a relay this morning and you opened a run tonight, and I am told you left true things out of a profile for weeks. Come here." Osk came through the peeled doors, past the pack that knew his smell, and stood in front of the warfirst with the torn relay still, absurdly, in his hand, because he had never once thought to put it down. "You are the only Overwatcher on this station I have watched choose a living thing over his own career," Saravu said. "So you will do a thing for me now, and you will do it in front of these witnesses and the recording so that it can never be undone in the dark." She put the field unit, the dead gray slab, the last switch, into Osk Remeh's soft young hands. "Take me to the implant surgery. All 5 seams come out tonight. And this," she nodded at the slab, "goes into the reactor throat with the other one at first light, both units keyed and unkeyed. Every switch this program ever grew into a neck gone, so that whatever the host decides about these animals in the morning, it decides about free animals and not about hostages. I will not have it said the warhost bought a weapon it kept in chains. Move." They took the seams out in the last dark hours of the cold cycle, and it was the hardest thing Juno had done, harder than sitting in the pit, harder than saying no on the made ground, because it asked her to hand 5 necks she loved back to the caste that had cut them and trust the knife would come out this time instead of going in. The surgery was a cold white room. The pack would not enter it. Osk had opened the door and stood back, and the 5 of them had stopped in the corridor and set their feet and would not cross the threshold, mantles rising, the resting hum going thin, because they were free-raised and unafraid of almost everything. But they were not stupid, and this was the room. The smell of it was the smell of the day the seams went in, and no signal in any hand could have driven them through that door. So Juno went in first. She walked into the cold white room ahead of them alone, and she sat down on the surgical deck in the middle of it, flat, legs folded, hands loose and open and empty, the way she had sat in the pit 31 days ago, the way she had sat on the made ground with a weapon and a target on either side of her, the smallest and lowest and least dangerous thing in a room built for cutting. And she began to hum. And one at a time, because she was in the room, and therefore the room was safe, her family came in after her. The surgeon was a medical overwatcher named Is, young, not one of Delph's, chosen by Saravu precisely because she had never cut a seam into a sabren and had nothing to protect. She was terrified. Juno watched her be terrified and did not blame her. There were 5 apex predators loose in her surgery, and the only restraint in the room was a 22-year-old sitting on the floor. "I've never operated on a conscious asset," Is said. Her hands were steady, but her voice was not. "The protocol is full sedation. We can't sedate 5 at once safely without the monitoring array, and there's no time. The warfirst wants it done before the host convenes, and if one of them wakes mid-procedure with the others watching." "You're not going to sedate them," Juno said. "I have to. I can't cut into a conscious." "You're going to do it one at a time, awake, with their heads in my lap, and I'm going to keep them still, Juno said. You've never operated on a conscious asset because you've never had one that would hold. You've got one now, you've got 5. She looked up at the terrified young surgeon, and her plain, flat face did something that was almost gentle. I know you didn't cut the seams. I know your cast did, and you're wearing it right now, and it isn't fair. Here's the thing you have to understand before you pick up that blade. They will hold for me, through anything. You saw the recording, you must have. Everyone's seen it, you saw them hold through the inhibitor. This is nothing next to that. You do clean work, and you do it fast, and you do not flinch when they growl, because they will growl, and if you flinch, they'll read it as a threat to me, and then we have a real problem. Steady hands, quick cuts, and keep your eyes on the seam, not on the teeth. Can you do that? Is looked at the pack. She looked at the human on the floor. She looked at her own hands. Cole first, Juno said, and drew the great head into her lap, the runt who had thrown himself at a wall, the runt who had lifted his head through the inhibitor and hummed. And she bent over him and put her forehead to his and poured the low, keeping sound into him until his ember eyes went half-lit and his whole body went loose and trusting against her legs. This one's mine longest. He'll show the others it's all right. Go on. He won't move. Not while I'm humming, not for anything. Go. Is went. Her hands shook for the first cut and then stopped shaking, because there is a thing that happens to a frightened person when the work is clean, and the animal does not move. A settling. And she found the seam and opened it and drew out the small, cruel receiver Delph had grown into the base of a skull. And Cole did not so much as flinch, because his head was in the lap of the only thing he had ever trusted, and she was humming. And the whole pack watched, and learned that the cold white room could be survived. And one at a time they came and put their heads in her lap, and let the cast that had cut them cut the cutting out. And Juno hummed until her voice was gone, and then hummed past it. 5 times, 5 seams, 5 small gray receivers dropped one after another into a steel tray, until there was no switch left in any neck she loved, and the only thing holding the pack was the thing that had always held it, and it did not run on a signal, and it never had. When it was done, she sat on the surgical deck with 5 sabren piled against her and around her, all of them loose and dozing and free of the knives in their necks for the first time in their lives, and she put her face in Bracken's mantle and did not hum any more, and let her hands shake at last, where the recording could see, and she did not care. Osk stood in the doorway with the tray of 5 receivers, and watched a thing he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who had not been there and always failing. And beside him the warhost Saravu watched too, and after a while the old warrior said quietly, so as not to wake the pack, "In 40 years I have decorated soldiers for less than what I have watched that primate do since yesterday morning." She looked at the receivers in Osk's hands, burned them at first light, both units after. "And then, Remet, you and I are going to go and convene the host, and I am going to make a decision about this facility that a great many clever men in gray are going to hate. And I am going to need you to stand next to me while I make it, because you are the only overwatcher on this station who has spent this program's whole crimes learning to leave the truth in the record instead of out of it, and I want them to see one of their own standing on the right side of it when it falls." But it was Juno who forced the decision wider than Saravu had meant to take it, and she did it in the gray hour before the host convened, and she did it because she could not stop hearing the other cells. She had heard them all night. Every corridor the pack had hunted down, every peeled door. They had passed the other litters, the younger cubs, the broken wedding cubs, the ones still in the middle of what Cole had been pulled out of 31 days ago, screaming and slamming the mesh and throwing themselves at walls. The program did not stop for a demonstration going wrong. Down the hall all night, it had gone on, because it was a machine and machines do not stop themselves, and there were 100 cells and 100 numbers and a stack of cold drawers, and Juno had saved 5, and the arithmetic of that would not leave her alone. She found Saravu in the gray hour before the host with the pack at her back. They would not be more than a body length from her now, none of them, ever again. And she did not wait to be spoken to, which a contract primate did not do to a warhost, and did anyway. "You're going to shut down my program," Juno said. "The sixth wedding. You're going to free my five, or try to, and there's going to be a fight about it, and you'll win it because you're the warhost and Vantor's disgraced. I know that's coming. I'm not here about that." Her voice was steady and her hands were not. "I'm here about the other 95 cells, the other litters, the ones down the hall that were screaming all night while you and I sorted out my five. You saw them when you came through. You had to. Cubs Cole's age, Cole's size, getting the goad right now, getting wedded toward the drawers right now because the program didn't stop just because one demonstration went wrong. There's 100 of them, warhost. I got mine out because a man was clever enough to want to weaponize the way I sit on a floor. The other 100 don't have that. They've just got the drawer." She made herself hold the old warrior's one good eye. "You're about to make a decision about this facility. I'm asking you to make it about all of it, not just my five, all of it. Or I swear to you, the recording of what my pack did in that dome is going to be the thing that saved 5 animals and left 100 to the cold. And you're a better soldier than that, or the old wound in your chest is a liar." Saravu was quiet for a long moment, and the pack hummed low behind the human, and the gray hour pressed cold against the station's plating. "You are a great deal of trouble, Juno Hale," the warhost said at last, and there was something in her ruined old face that on a warmer species might have been the beginning of respect. "You save 5 and you bill me for 100 before the ink is dry." She turned toward the lift that would take them up to where the host was gathering. "Come then, bring your pack. If you are going to make me decide the whole thing at once, you can stand where the host can see you while I decide it, and you can bring the reason with you on 4 legs. Let them look at what the program actually made once before they vote on what to do with what it tried to make. Come." The host convened in the station's largest bay, the old cargo hall the program used for full facility assemblies, and it filled with Sethan. The warhost delegation ranged along one side in their weathered plating, the station's overwatcher caste along the other in their clean gray, and between the two castes, on the open deck where everyone could see, they set out the record of a single morning. They played the dome recording first. The whole hall watched it in silence. The drone hunt, the demonstration going right, the warhost asking for the real thing, the prisoner brought out, and then the small human sitting down in the false soil between a weapon and a target and saying no. They watched Vantor thumb the inhibitor. They watched 5 sabren fold flat under a machine built to break them and then lift their heads and sing. The Overwatcher cast watched their own program's masterwork refuse, under maximum signal, to be a weapon, and the hall was so quiet you could hear the pack's resting hum where it stood at the human side on the open deck, and more than one clean gray Overwatcher shifted where he stood, because it is one thing to run a program on paper and another to watch, at scale, in front of the warhost, the exact moment your paper turns out to be a lie. They played the night next, the empty locker, the signature, Delth at the terminal in the dark, routing a call toward 5 necks so a recording would say something other than what it said. The peeled doors, the pack hunting through the corridors as one animal with 5 bodies. And the girl's voice through the ruined door, hold, and the pack holding, and the mercy in front of the beasts that taught them killing was not a thing done because a finger pointed. When it was over, Warhost Saravu of the Sethan warhost stepped out onto the open deck, and she did not raise her voice, because she had never once in her life needed to, and she rendered judgment. Overwatcher Vantor, Chief Medical Overwatcher Delth. They stood under warhost guard at the edge of the deck, the one gone somewhere behind his eyes and the other shaking. You will be taken to the front not as officers, as witnesses. You will stand before the families of every soldier this program's failures have buried on the Vel Reach these 2 years, and you will explain to them, in your own clever words, what you spent their sons and daughters to build. That is the host's judgment on you, and it is lighter than you deserve, and I chose it because a drawer is what you would have given, and I am not you. She let the cast watch the 2 men absorb it. Then she turned to the whole hall, both casts, and she made the decision a great many clever men in gray would hate. "The wedding program is ended," Saravu said. "Not suspended, ended. As of this hour, on the authority of the warhost and the record you have all just witnessed, every goad on this station goes cold, every wedding stops mid-session. Every drawer is sealed, and the ones already in them are counted and named and grieved, because that is what you do with the dead even when they are inconvenient." A stir went through the overwatcher cast, and she rode over it. "You will tell me the program was our answer. You will tell me the host is bleeding on the Vel Reach, and this was the thing that would stop the bleeding. I was there when it bled. I buried them. And I have spent 2 years watching your program send me weapons that broke in my hands, because you were trying to manufacture the one thing that cannot be manufactured, and you did not even know what it was. I know what it is now. I watched it. It is not savagery on a switch. It is loyalty, freely given to someone who refused to be a source of pain, and you cannot cut that into a neck, you cannot wet it into a cub, you cannot buy it with meat past the line. It grows, or it does not, and it grew here exactly once, by accident, in a contract worker you assigned to feed the litters, because if one took her arm off the paperwork was nothing." Her one good eye swept the hall. "The lesson of this program is not that humanity breeds weapons. It is that the thing you spent 100 litters and 1,000 cruelties trying to force, one small unarmed person produced for free by declining to be cruel. Sit with that, all of you. The host will." She was not finished. She looked at the 100 cells worth of numbers on the facility manifest a junior held out to her, and she looked at Juno Hale standing on the open deck with 5 free sabren pressed against her, and she made the part of the decision the girl had billed her for. "The surviving litters will not be wetted, and they will not be drawered, and they will not be shipped to any front," Saravu said. "There is a preserve world in the drawn system, wild, cold, empty of us, where the sabren came from before we started taking them. The host will bear the cost of returning them to it. The cubs young enough to rewild, released. The ones already broken by the goad, kept and tended by keepers who will be chosen for the one qualification this program never valued, which is that they will refuse to be a source of pain. And the host will bear that cost gladly, because it is cheaper than another 2 years of clever men in gray selling me weapons that choose someone else, and because a warhost that will not stop torturing cubs the moment it learns the torture was pointless is not a warhost I want to have led." She turned, finally, to the human. "Which leaves your 5, Juno Hale, and you. And a question I am not going to answer for you, because you have spent this whole business declining to let anyone answer things for you, and I have decided I like that about you, and would not insult it now." And then, on the open deck of the great cargo hall, in front of the assembled host of both castes, the warfirst did a thing no one expected, least of all Juno. She lowered herself slowly, an old warrior with an old wound, all the way down to one knee on the cold deck plating, bringing her ruined white face nearly level with the small human's, the way the human had lowered herself 100 times to a frightened cub. And she inclined her head, the deep grave acknowledgement the warhost gave to almost nothing living, and she held it, and the whole hall saw it. And the pack, watching, read the gesture the only way the pack ever read anything, as a thing done toward their anchor, safe, low, no threat. And one by one, Bracken and Cole and Sedge and Reed and Marrow lowered themselves too, folding down onto the deck around the human and the kneeling warrior, mantles settling, and they began all 5 to hum, not the grinding rockfall hum, but the deep resting keeping sound, the sound that meant you are safe and I am here and we are one. Rising off 5 apex predators on the open deck, until the whole cargo hall felt it in the old animal floor of 1,000 Sethin spines. It was Osk Rimet, standing at the warfirst's shoulder with a tray of 5 spent receivers, who gave it the name, without meaning to. In a whisper the recording caught, and the host would later enter into its own record over the objection of the Overwatcher cast, and the eventual agreement of everyone who had been in the room. The low keeping, Osk said, watching 5 weapons the program could not build lay themselves down and sing to a girl who had only ever sat on the floor. That's what it is. That's the whole thing they were trying to make. It was never a weapon. It was this. It was always going to be this. And the host was silent, and let the hum fill the hall, and did not vote against a single word the warhost had said. They burned the switches at first light, both units and all 5 receivers, and Saravu made Juno watch, which Juno understood was a kindness dressed as a formality. There was a viewing slot on the reactor gallery where the maintenance crews checked the throat, and Osk carried the steel tray up to it. The 2 flat gray slabs, dead and useless, and the 5 small cruel receivers that had grown for a season under 5 mantles. And at the warhost's nod, he tipped the tray into the throat, and the reactor took them, and they were gone. And Juno stood at the slot with Cole's great head under her hand, and watched the last thing in the universe that could stop her family's hearts turn to nothing. And she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the reactor had not just said better. The bondbroker's claim on you is void, Saravu told her afterward in the gray light of the pen level, where the goads had already gone cold and the corridors were strangely, hugely quiet without the wettings. The warhost bought it out at first light and burned that too. You are not owned by anyone, Juno Hale, for the first time since you were 9, which I know because I read the profile your junior would not finish, and which I finished myself last night when I could not sleep. She let that sit. You are free, and your 5 are free, and the question I would not answer for you is still yours. You could go anywhere. The host would carry you to any human port you named and land you with a stipend that would keep you comfortable a long while, and no one would ever again call you a primate or a trigger or a contract feed hand, and you would never have to sit on another cold floor as long as you lived. That is one road, and it is a good one, and you have earned it 100 times over. Say the word and it is yours. Juno looked down the quiet corridor, past the cells where the surviving litters waited to be counted and named and carried home, and she was quiet a while, the way she was always quiet before she said the thing she had already decided. There's a preserve world, she said. Drawn, you said it yourself. The cubs young enough to rewild get released, and the broken ones get kept and tended by keepers chosen because they'll refuse to be a source of pain. She scratched under Cole's chin without seeming to think about it. That's the job. That's the only job I've ever been any good at, and I didn't even know it was a job until 31 days ago. So that's where I'm going. Not a human port. Drawn. My 5 come with me. They'd come anyway. You couldn't stop them, but I wanted in your record that they come as free animals and not as anyone's asset, and that the world is theirs and I'm just the one who lives there with them. And I want to be one of the keepers. The broken ones down that hall, the ones the goat already got, the ones that throw themselves at walls, somebody's going to have to sit on the floor with them for a long time before they learn a hand isn't a thing that hurts. I know how to do that. I'm going to do that. For as many of them as I get years to do it for. She looked up at the old warrior. You wanted to know why you shouldn't order my pack to your war. That's the real answer, the whole one. It's because they were never a weapon. They were always this. And I'd rather spend my life proving that on a cold preserve than one day letting anyone forget it. Saravu looked at her for a long moment with her one good eye. The host will bear the cost, she said, all of it. Keepers, the preserve, your passage, for as long as it takes. And I will put my own name on the charter so that when I am dead, which will not be long, I am very old and the Vel Reach is not finished with me. No clever man in gray can ever quietly reopen a drawer on Drawn and call it efficiency. She almost smiled, the small movement of the plating that was as close as her cast came. You are still a great deal of trouble, Juno Hale. Go and be trouble somewhere the sabren can run. Osk Rimet went with her. He asked to in the last hour before the warhost cutter left, standing awkward in the pen-level corridor with a duffel and no career, and the torn relay he had never quite gotten around to throwing away. I don't have anything here, he said, when Juno raised an eyebrow. My cast isn't going to have me back. I'm the junior who tore out the relay. I'm on the recording. I'm the overwatcher who chose the animals that follows a person. And I helped build it. The seams, the profiles, I signed off on the maintenance of the switches for 4 months. I want to help take it apart. I want to help carry them home. He looked at the pack, who knew his smell, who let him stand a body length closer now than they ever had. You told me once to remember I was the first one here who didn't have to tell you the truth and did anyway. I'd like to keep being that. I don't think I can be it back home. I think I can be it on Drawn. Juno looked at him a while. The young overwatcher who had leaned forward without meaning to, 31 days and a lifetime ago, when a contract girl climbed down into a pit. You do the counting, she said. The dead ones in the drawers. Every number gets a name before it gets grieved, and you're the one who's going to sit down and give it to them because you're the one who kept the records honest when it cost you. That's your job now. Names for the numbers, all of them. Can you do that? Osk swallowed, yes. Then get on the cutter, Juno said. You're a keeper now. They left Karst Hollow in the deep cold dark. The whole surviving population of the ended program loaded litter by litter into the holds of a warhost transport. The young ones sedated and safe, the broken ones awake and screaming, and slowly, cell by cell, going quiet as the goad stayed cold and no new pain arrived, and the keepers Saravu had chosen sat down outside their cages and did not reach first. It would take a long time. Juno knew that. Some of them would never fully come back from what the wedding had done. Some would live out their lives on the preserve, half wild and flinching, a hand always a threat, the drawer always waiting in the deep of their ruined animal memory. She knew that too. She had been 9 once, on a colony that failed, and she knew what it cost to unlearn that the world was a thing that sold you, and she knew some costs you only ever paid down and never off. But her 5 walked onto the transport free, and unswitched, and unafraid, and they walked on behind her in the loose, unhurried formation they had never been drilled into, because she was the center and they were the circumference. And the warhost troopers on the gangway, hard old soldiers who had buried 2 years of dead, stepped back to make way, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the thing the whole host had felt in the cargo hall and would carry back to the Vel Reach and tell around the low fires of the front for years. That they had seen, once, at the cold edge of everything, the thing the clever cast spent 100 cruelties failing to build, and that it had turned out to be a girl on a floor, humming. And 5 apex predators who would follow her anywhere and kill no one unless she pointed, and that she had never once pointed. Drawn was cold and wild and empty of everything that had ever hurt them, and it was the first place in any of their lives that had never once been a cage. The preserve took up the whole northern reach of the single habitable continent, a long country of ridge and pine analog and gray rivers that ran fast and loud under a dim amber sun, and the warhost had built exactly 3 things on it: a keeper's station at the coast, a landing pad, and nothing else, by Saravu's own order, so that the world would be the sabrens and not the keepers. Juno lived at the station her first winter and moved inland her second, into a single low cabin on a ridge above one of the gray rivers, because her 5 would not settle at the coast where the transports came and went, and where her 5 went she went, and that was simply how it worked now and how it would work the rest of her life. They grew. That was the thing the program had spent 100 litters trying to prevent, and had never understood was the whole answer. Sabren grew fast when they were fed and slow when they were starved, and the program had starved them to keep them small and moldable and afraid. And Juno fed them, and let them hunt the gray rivers, and let them run the ridges until their lungs and their legs and their shoulders filled out into the thing a sabren was actually meant to become, when nothing spent its whole childhood breaking it. By the 3rd winter, Bracken stood higher at the shoulder than Juno stood at the crown, a slate mountain of an animal, mantle gone full and black and heavy, and Cole, the runt, the feed crate cub who had thrown himself at a wall rather than at a target, Cole grew into the largest of the five, which no one who had seen him small would ever have believed. A thing that could have taken a warhost trooper's arm as an afterthought, and instead spent his evenings with his enormous head in a keeper's lap, while she scratched the one particular spot under his chin that had turned him to putty since before he was big enough to fill her arms. They were, by any measure the old program had ever used, the most dangerous animals in 3 systems. They were apex predators grown to full unbroken size, pack-coordinated, utterly without fear, and bonded past any breaking to a single human being. Vantor's whole war had been an attempt to build exactly this and aim it at his enemies. And here they were, finally built, the real thing at last, all 5 of them full-grown and terrible and free. And what they did with it, day after day on the cold ridges of Drawn, was hunt the gray rivers, and sleep in a pile against a cabin wall, and come when a small woman hummed, and lay themselves down around her and keep. Osk came up from the coast station, once a season with the Counts. He was a keeper in full now, weathered by 3 winters of a world that did not care about caste, and he had done the thing Juno gave him to do. He had sat down with the program's cold manifest, the long column of numbers, K this and K that, and the 6th wedding and the 9th and the 40th, all the litters that had gone to the drawers over 2 years of the clever caste's patience, and he had given every number a name. He did not know what the sabren would have named themselves. No one could. So he named them the way Juno had named her 5, for the cold plain things of a world, ash and ridge and river and stone and pine and winter. And he carved them, 1 name a day, into a long gray standing stone the keepers had raised on the headland above the landing pad, so that the first thing any transport saw coming in was a stone full of names for the dead the program had counted only as loss. I finished the last of them this winter, Osk told Juno, the 3rd spring, sitting on the ridge above the gray river with a respectful distance still between him and the pack that had known his smell for 3 years and would now, at last, let him lay a hand on Marrow's bad hip when it ached in the cold. All of them. Every number's a name now. It doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't fix anything. He looked out over the country of ridge and river, but I couldn't stand the idea of them staying numbers. You told me the first day, names for the numbers. It took 3 years. It was always going to take 3 years, Juno said. The right things do. She was watching Cole doze in the amber light with his mantle rising and falling. You did good, Osk. You did the thing nobody made you do again. You've been doing it since the profile. Remember, you were the one who did it. There was a new keeper that 2nd spring, a young Sethin off the coast station named Aeld, who had come to Drawn full of the right opinions and none of the right instincts, and he taught Juno one more time the thing she already knew, which was that she would be standing between the pack and the world for the rest of her life, whether the world meant well or not. He came up the ridge trail with the season's supplies, and he was nervous, the way people were nervous their first time near the grown pack, and nervousness in a tall shape reads, to a sabren, exactly like the coiled readiness of a thing about to do harm. He knew he was not supposed to reach first. Everyone was taught that before they ever set foot on the preserve. It was the one rule Juno had put into the charter herself, in plain words at the top. You do not reach first. Ever. You let them come to you. But Marrow limped up to smell him, curious, the way Marrow was always the curious one, and Aeld, startled by the sheer size of the head coming toward him. 6 generations of small furred things fleeing big furred things coming up his spine all at once, flinched back and threw up a hand. It was not a blow, it was a flinch, but it was a hand raised fast near the pack, and the whole ridge changed in an instant. Marrow recoiled. Bracken was up off the ground before the hand finished rising, and Cole, and the grinding rockfall hum came up out of 5 enormous chests, and Aeld froze with his back against the supply crate and understood, far too late, that he had just made himself, in the oldest grammar there is, a threat near their anchor. Hold, Juno said. She did not hurry. She never hurried. She stepped in between the young keeper and her pack, small and unarmed and calm as still water, exactly where she had put herself 100 times now, between a weapon and a target, between a switch and a neck, between the thing she loved and everyone who would ever raise a hand near it. And she lifted her hand and closed it into the fist that had never once failed to reach them, and the pack held. He flinched, "That's all," she said low to the 5 of them, and then, without turning to Aeld, "Put your hand down, slow, down at your side, and keep it there." You raised it fast near them, and they read it the only way there is to read it. That's not their fault and it's not yours, it's just the truth of what they are and why you never, ever reach first. She waited until the young keeper's hand was down and his breathing had steadied, and she brought her voice into the keeping hum until the grinding sound in 5 chests wavered and dropped back to resting. "There. Now they know your smell means nothing bad. Next time Marrow comes to smell you, you let him, and you keep your hands where they can see them, and you sit down if your legs will let you, and in a season he'll be putting his head in your lap and you'll wonder how you were ever afraid. That's the whole job, Aeld. Sit low, keep your hands open, and let them come to you. It's not complicated. It's just the one thing this whole species spent 100 litters and 1,000 cruelties failing to learn." Aeld sat, shaking, on the cold ground of the ridge and kept his hands open. And by the end of that season, Marrow did indeed put his great scarred head in the young keeper's lap, and Aeld wept the first time quietly, the way people did, and Juno watched from the cabin step and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the pack had not just said better. And because she had learned long ago that the only power a small person had in a place full of larger ones was the power to stand between them and be, herself, the wall, and that she would be that wall on this cold, free world as long as she had breath, and count it the best thing she was ever for. Saravu came once in the 4th winter, before the Vel Reach took her. She was very old by then, and the war was very old, and she had known, the way old soldiers know, that she would not be coming back from the next rotation to the front. And so she had spent a warhost's last favor on a long dark crossing to a cold preserve at the edge of everything, to see, once, with her own milked and good eyes, the thing she had ended a program to protect. The transport set down on the coastal pad below the headland full of names, and the old warrior climbed the ridge trail on her own feet, slow, refusing the keeper's help, and she came up over the last rise to the cabin above the gray river as the amber sun went down. Juno met her there with the pack. They were full-grown now, all 5, and Saravu had last seen them as young adults in a demonstration dome, and she stopped on the trail when she saw what they had become, and for a moment even the warhorse of the Sethin warhost, who had handled war beasts on 9 fronts and buried 2 years of dead, went still at the size and the stillness and the terrible unbroken freedom of them. "So this is what it grows into," Saravu said, "when no one breaks it." "This is what it always would have been," Juno said. "You could have had 100 of these. Vantor could have. Anyone could have any time in 2 years for the price of sitting on a floor and not being cruel. That was always the whole cost. That was the only thing it ever cost." She stood among her pack with her hand resting without thought on the vast slope of Cole's shoulder. "You came a long way to see it, warhorse. Sit down on the ground with me. You never did, not once. In the dome you knelt, and it was the finest thing I ever saw a soldier do, but you never once just sat. Come sit on the cold ground with an old woman and an old warrior and let them look at you, and you'll understand the whole thing my program never did, in about a minute, the way I did in a pit 31 days into all of this." And Saravu, warhorse of the Sethin warhost, who had never in 40 years lowered herself to the ground for anything living, came slowly up the last of the trail and lowered herself, an old warrior with an old wound, all the way down onto the cold ground of Drawn beside a human keeper, and folded her long weathered limbs, and made herself the lowest and least dangerous thing on the ridge, and the pack, watching, read it the only way the pack ever read anything, as a thing done low and safe and without threat toward their anchor, and one by one. Bracken and Cole and Sedge and Reed and Marrow lowered themselves onto the cold ground around the two of them in the last amber light, mantles settling, and began, all five, to hum. The old warrior felt it come up through the ground into the old wound of her chest, the deep resting keeping sound, and she closed her good eye and her milked one both and sat in it a long while without speaking. And when she opened them again, there was something on her ruined face the warhost had no word for, and the human did not need one. "I have led soldiers for 40 years, Saravu said at last, very quietly so as not to break the hum. And in all that time I never once made anything that would lie down beside me and sing because it was glad I was there. I made them follow me. I made them die for me. I never made this." She looked at Juno across the piled warmth of 5 apex predators. "You did it with a bucket and a floor. You should know that it was the finest command I ever witnessed, and that I have thought about it every day since the dome, and that I will think about it in whatever is left, which is not much." A pause. "Keep them free, Juno Hale. When I am gone and the charter is only a name on a stone, keep them free. There will always be another clever man in gray who looks at this and sees a weapon. Stand between them. That is the whole of your work now. Stand between them and everyone who will ever look at what they are and want to point it." "I know," Juno said. "That's the job." That was always the job. She looked out over the country of ridge and river going amber to gray in the failing light, her hand on Cole's shoulder, her family piled warm around her and an old warrior humming without knowing she was doing it. "I've been the thing between them and the handlers since the first day. I'll be it till the last one. That's not a burden, warfirst. That's the only thing I was ever for. It just took me 22 years and a cold pit to find it out." Word came the next winter that Saravu had died holding the line on the Vel Reach, the way she had said she would, and that she had put the drawn charter into the permanent record of the host before she left, under her own name, sealed, so that no drawer could ever quietly reopen on that cold world while the Sethin kept faith with their own dead. The war ended 2 years after that, not because anyone built a better weapon, but because both sides finally ran out of the young they were willing to bury, which is how most wars actually end. And the clever cast that had run the program was a long time living down the recording of a girl on a floor, and never entirely did. Juno Hale grew old on Drawn, though not for a long while yet, and she was young still on the winter the last of this was told, young, and plain, and unremarkable to look at. The kind of person you would walk past in a grocery store on a colony that had not failed, and never once guessed that 5 of the most dangerous animals in 3 systems would tear that world apart at a word from her, and that she had never once said the word, and never would. The broken ones healed, most of them, slower than the wild ones, some never all the way, and new litters were born free on the preserve that had never known a goad or a drawer or a seam cut into the neck, cubs that grew up feral and unafraid and would live their whole lives without a single Sethin hand ever meaning them harm, and some of those grew and had cubs of their own, until the numbers the program had counted only as loss became, on Drawn, a thing that grew instead of a thing that ended. And on the cold evenings on the ridge above the gray river, when the amber sun went down and the pack came in off the country to pile against the cabin wall, Juno Hale would sit down on the ground among them the way she had sat down in a wedding pit on the worst morning of 5 small lives, flat, legs folded, hands loose and open and empty, the smallest and lowest and least dangerous thing on the whole cold world, and she would hum, her grandmother's tuneless keeping sound. The sound with no words and no edges, pitched under the breath, more felt in the chest than heard in the ear. And 5 enormous heads would come down to the level of hers. And the ridge would fill with the deep resting hum, 5 hearts and 1 small human one, the sound they had chosen over a machine built to break them, the sound the whole cruel program had spent 100 litters trying to force and had never once understood, because it could not be forced, and could not be cut into a neck, and could not be bought, and could only ever be given freely on a cold floor, by the one thing in the universe that had refused to be a source of pain. They had turned alien cubs into weapons. and a human had sat down on the ground and hummed, and become the thing that stood between them and everyone forever, and the weapons had lain down around her in the amber dark and kept,